Great, thank you. So thank you all so much for joining us this morning for the second event. This event is part of the Coastal Communities Adapting Together programme of activities, all focusing on climate change adaptation in coastal communities. And our PI, Karen Foley, will be giving you a broader introduction to the project shortly. I'm Emma McKinley, I'm a research fellow at Cardiff University, and I'm here to help chair the sessions and kind of moderate the Q&A over the next 3 days. And while we knew, I think a year ago when we ran our first event, that the second time was not going to be an in-person event, I think we still would love to all be together at an in-person event, but that's still not possible. So this is very much an audience participation is required type of activity. So please put your comments, your feedback, any references to reports or projects that you think people would be interested in seeing, introduce yourselves into the chat box so we can see who's here, and then use the Q&A for any questions that you have for our participants and our panelists. We'll hopefully have time after each speaker to ask them a couple of questions, but there is a dedicated discussion panel at the end of each morning, so we'll get a bit more interaction and a bit more discussion happening at that point. We would love you to interact with us online, so please tweet and use other social media platforms that you might use, and tag us using CCAT project and hashtag CCAT 2021. All of you as participants are muted and your cameras are automatically switched off, as I'm sure you're all very used to with Zoom now, but just to be aware that we are recording the session, so just so you're aware of that. If there are any parts of the sessions that you have to jump out of, or if you can't make the whole programme of speakers over the next 3 days, please don't worry, the recordings will all be made available on the CCAT website in the next couple of weeks. And just as a note, there will be a feedback form that will be going around the chat box later in the session, but also sent around as an email on Friday and later next week. So please do fill that out. We'd love to hear what you think of the next 3 days and any ideas of what you think we can do in the future. So just to really bring us back to CCAT 2020 and where this event started from, the first of our events was held in November of last year. We had planned for it to be in person and we had to move to an online event, and it was really, really well received. We had a very interactive and engaged audience across 3 days in November of last year. And I just wanted to remind us of some of the key messages that came out of those discussions, because I think they've really framed the design and the development of this programme, of this CCAT 2021 event. So the first was that the urgency of climate change adaptation cannot be underestimated. And there was a real feeling that we needed to be proactive rather than reactive in our decision making and our management around coastal management, coastal decisions and climate adaptation in those coastal spaces. We heard a lot from our speakers at CCAT 2020 around the importance of community and stakeholder engagement and the challenges around that. So the need for adequate resourcing, the availability of appropriate funding, and the use of effective communication tools to really ensure that we are engaging meaningfully with our communities and stakeholders. There was a real call for interdisciplinarity and working not just across academic disciplines, but also across sectors and policy areas in order to really deliver the change that we need urgently to support climate change adaptation. We heard a lot about examples from different community case studies and work that's happening in different places across Ireland and Wales, and we'll hear more of that over the next 3 days. And I guess really what that kind of highlights to us is that there is not a one size fits all, and there's perhaps an importance for us to draw on best practice from different places, and as I said earlier, to really move away from this kind of reactive thinking and to plan and be proactive in our decision making. And crucially, I think for me, one of the most fundamental messages of our last event was to really recognise the coast, this idea of it as being a national asset, a place that we value and that we need to build into our thinking and into our planning in an effective way, particularly when we think of climate change and what that means for our coastal communities now and of course in the future. And of course, all of these conversations are really quite timely given that we're on the run up to COP happening in the next few weeks. I know Karen's going to talk about that, and we have other speakers who'll be discussing that this morning. So I just wanted to give you a quick reminder of the agenda for today. We will have a number of speakers drawing on kind of different examples of coastal management. We'll have speakers from Climate Ireland and Climate Cymru. And then we'll look at some examples of things that are happening in communities in different places. So we'll have a speaker from Fairbourne moving forward in Wales, but also some examples from work that's happening outside of the UK, from Cormac Walsh, who'll be talking about work he's been doing in the Wadden Sea in Germany. There will be a break. So we will make sure that there's definitely time for refreshments, and I'm sure you can work out exactly what you want from that: teas, coffees, cakes, all those sorts of things. With no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Karen, our PI. Oh no, I'm going to hand over to Councillor Josh Benyon from Pembrokeshire County Council as our welcoming speaker. So Josh, I'll hand over to you. Josh has been very much involved with our CCAT project for the last couple of years, and has been instrumental in the collaboration between CCAT and Pembrokeshire County Council, and some work that we did for the council last year. So it's been great to have you to come along and to welcome our attendees and our speakers for this year's event. So I'll hand over to you, Josh. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma, and good morning, everyone. Let me just share my screen quickly, and then we will be ready to go.
Yeah, perfect.
So I'm Councillor Josh Benyon, as Emma just alluded to. I've been an elected member now at Pembrokeshire County Council for about 4.5 years. And when I joined the council, we didn't have any climate change action plan whatsoever, or what we were going to do. So, 2017, very much aware of what climate change was and the impact it was having on our communities, but nothing was done. And I've put in this picture here of a Newgale beach in Pembrokeshire. So very much, as you can see, completely flooded. There's actually a road supposed to be there, and it's one of the main roads that links sort of some of the northern communities that we serve, but just an impact that in Pembrokeshire is very much real, and it's up to all of us in our communities to try and change this. Just a bit of a timeline here really on what we've actually done then as a local authority. In May 2019, we declared a climate emergency and began working on what we have now as a net zero carbon action plan by 2030. We've kind of tried to break that up really into different sectors of what we do as a local authority and what kind of the Pembrokeshire economy is made of. And a lot of this information kind of has helped from the CCAT project, in the fact that we were probably very good at talking amongst our little working group about what we wanted to do, but not very good at talking across the whole authority and maybe opening up to the wider community. And I think by having CCAT in, that's kind of opened that up for us, and it's been really, really beneficial to actually go, oh, maybe we weren't as great in this area or as bad in this area as we once thought. Local government is definitely crucial in adaptation. That's one of the things that came from the CCAT results on a further slide, which I'll show you after, is that people expect local government to lead in local communities and actually serve. And we've obviously just, obviously in Wales now had our Senate elections, and we've now got a Minister for Climate Change as well. So there's that national policy directive as well to say that we're not doing something in isolation. We've got that support as well from national government, which I think is very important. Obviously the national strategies as well, with the UK government law as well, and I put the enemy number one is at the gate, so we've got to try and meet these targets. I don't think they're not achievable. I think we can very much achieve them, but I think that it requires a lot of support as well from those national governments as well. There's only so much control within local government, and I think the important thing about what we gained as well from that from CCAT involvement is actually open up to other partners as well, and actually understanding what they're doing, and maybe looking outwards. I think it's very hard when you're struggling, you've got all these targets and all this legislation, maybe just to look down at the desk and not look up. But I think we very much tried to kind of broaden our horizons a bit. Obviously Welsh Government have got their own targets as well, so a carbon neutral public sector by 2030, 70% of consumed electricity from renewables by 2030, which is very important for us in Pembrokeshire, because there's a lot of movement as well with the Swansea-based city deal, and a lot of renewable energy companies starting up as well with offshore floating wind, some really sort of exciting stuff. And then the actual impacts that we're currently seeing and only expect to get worse. So just to say that the impact cannot be underestimated. We've got a very, very large amount of areas below sea level in Pembrokeshire. For those that aren't aware of the geography of Pembrokeshire, most of our county is covered by, is surrounded by the sea, which makes it very, very prone then to climate change and the impacts of such. Shoreline management plans as well, our needs to adapt, and that ecological environmental threat. And obviously we need to do this because climate change is bad, but that huge cost impact as well. And when we're trying to run other public services as well, it makes it so much more difficult if we're being reactive rather than proactive. And I think that we're trying to do as much as we can as a local authority to try and change that. So what are we doing? Our own measurable emissions. So obviously non-domestic buildings, street lighting, fleet mileage, business mileage. There's lots of other stuff as well. We've opened it up to housing, procurement, which is very, very important to us. That's a massive part of what we do as a local authority, which I think isn't really talked about enough across the public sector, in the power that we actually have to influence others outside of the public sector and the private sector with our procurement streams. Our wider climate emergency and influence as well is very important. I think it's very easy to say we're only going to look at what we're doing, and it doesn't matter what the people who live within our county or work within our county or the businesses that work are doing, but we need to open that up further and actually try and support those individuals, those people, those businesses to actually do things themselves and actually have the resources and the tools to do it. I don't think it's right for us to kind of be preachy and say to people, do this, but I think if we can provide people with the tools and resources, people do want to make a change. I regularly hear as a politician that people do want action on climate change, so very much so. And obviously COP26, obviously we won't be going as a local authority, but very much what we can do within our own sort of cluster and that Southwest Wales region as well, and actually realizing that we can form these partnerships locally. We don't have to wait for these events to actually do something. We can do something sooner. Service impact of climate change then. So it's I put there providing opportunity, which I think is very important. I think it's quite easy sometimes to talk about maybe doom and gloom when it comes to climate change, which is probably true, but at the same time there's some really great opportunities. We've had a complete overhaul now of our waste and recycling system in Pembrokeshire. We've got the highest recycling rate in Wales. It went up about 10 to 11% over the course of a year, just from actually recognizing that we could do stuff. We actually saved some money as well, and we've actually got met Welsh Government targets. So it's ticked about 3 boxes for us, and also much better from a service user involvement, in that people in Pembrokeshire are really happy with the system and feel that they're not throwing as much in their black bags or their sort of residual waste, that they can actually contribute themselves and actually recycle. And I think that's really, really important. Our housing stock as well, as a local authority, what we can actually do around there. So obviously retrofitting our existing properties, high energy sustainability for new. So all of our new building schemes now to look at, the solar panels, pump heaters, everything that we can to make them as energy efficient as possible, which is really, really important. And then a little bit more really just before I run out of time on the CCAT offer to PCC. So this was our offer to kind of share experience, systems and policies with Fingal County Council for elected members and officers, and then follow the survey. So we let it go, and this is what we learned from CCAT. So these were the main sort of words and themes that came out. As you can see in the top left-hand corner, somebody said that really annoying Scandinavian girl. We obviously maybe didn't realize that everyone was quite on board with our agenda to do something around climate change as we would have liked, but nonetheless, that doesn't matter. The vast majority of people want to see something, and this is local authority staff, public. You've got their weather, flooding, just the really words that actually come out and what comes to people's mind. And I think it's actually very important that what's actually come out of there is probably quite unique to Pembrokeshire. Whilst a lot of people would say it, flooding being a very, very coastal area, that is something that we do see a lot of now, and people do notice these things. And I think our job is to link it up and say, this isn't just happening because it's normal, it's happening more frequently because of climate change, and this is what we're going to do as a local authority. And I think that's one of the things that's been really beneficial for us for CCAT, is that link up between what communities are saying, what climate change is, and how we can bridge that between the two. One of the things that we haven't done enough is we've done too much internal talking and not enough external. So again, thanks to CCAT, we thought we did a good job, if I'm being honest, on talking with people about what we were doing, but not many people actually heard that we had done the term climate emergency and what that actually meant. I think they thought it was just a phrase that we said, oh, there we are, climate emergency, and carried on as normal, when actually we had so much more to follow it. We had that action plan, we have this continual engagement, we have this constant work to actually reach net zero. And I think that's one of the things that we're continually working on, but maybe we didn't realize was actually a barrier or a problem prior to CCAT's involvement. And it's up to us to lead. So we asked, who is responsible for minimising the impacts of climate change? Obviously, you've got the UK government, which is very high in business industry, but local authorities then are a joint third of individuals. And I would probably be very interested to see what that would be repeated now after COVID. I think one of the things that COVID's done is actually highlighted the importance of local communities and local government, and I would very much say that most people would probably add a couple of percentage points on there and actually recognize that importance of doing things locally to actually tackle local problems as well, but really just reaffirm that we actually have a responsibility. And at least 0% of the respondents said none of the above, so that's one good thing. And just really, just to quote here, the offshore renewable energy sector is an engine for growth for coastal communities. So again, as I said, we've got some really, really exciting projects as well. And it's really important that where we have got that, political commitment from, whether it's Welsh or national government, to kind of seize that opportunity and take it as well. And I think, historically, maybe we haven't got involved in these kind of larger scale projects because they're kind of outside of our scope and outside of our realm. But what that's kind of shown us through the process of this is that we can influence and we can do things to actually kind of improve the lives of not just people within our own area, but that kind of wider region and country as well, which is really, really important. So I think I did that in just about 10 minutes. So just a thank you. My Twitter and LinkedIn is there if anyone wants to kind of follow me or ask me questions, and then my email as well. But thank you very much. Yeah, great.
Thank you so much, Josh, and thank you for drawing on some of the results of the work that we did with PCC, I guess 18 months ago now. And I think that's a really important point, thinking about how quickly these things move on and the impact of something so huge like the COVID pandemic and what that might have done in terms of public perceptions. I do think it's interesting that those results were quite close together. I think you kind of drawing on the fact that it's up to us, it's up to everybody to take that action, and it's not going to be one approach or one kind of group that solves these things. It is about working in an interdisciplinary collaborative way, and that really draws on some of the messages that we heard last year as well. So thank you so much for setting the scene for us so brilliantly. And there is one question that's actually come in while you've been speaking, and it's partially to do with CCAT, which we can answer later. But it's from someone who's asked about the impact of increasing vessel traffic in Pembrokeshire on marine mammals, and the fact that those vessels, that vessel traffic may increase with climate change, I guess servicing renewable energy infrastructure, I would assume. I could be wrong, so apologies if I've misinterpreted that. And the question is really, is our local authorities looking at that interaction between marine mammals and increased vessel traffic? I can answer the CCAT part, is that that's not part of our project, but there are other projects that are exploring those sorts of topics, but it's not something we're looking at. Josh, could you answer the part around the local authorities from Pembrokeshire's perspective, please?
Yeah, just really to say, and to be honest, and I said that obviously historically as a local authority, those type of projects which the planning doesn't even go through us, it will go through Welsh Government ministers or anyone that they delegate to. We haven't really got involved. We've, maybe raised an objection here or there, but I think that's very important as well. I think what makes our area very unique is that the biodiversity, that ecological diversity, and I don't think that we're actually doing enough at the moment on actually recognizing that whilst we've got some really great positives here with renewable energy sector, but also we need to do as much as we can to protect and enhance the local environment. So not something we've done previously, but we have started to, so that's a positive as well. And actually also working with other local authorities, probably on that kind of coastal area that's close to us, just to see that that's not just going to affect us, it's going to affect them as well, and vice versa if they've got a project.
That's great. Thank you so much. And again, that message of kind of cooperation and collaborative working, and not sort of working in silo is really important. Thank you so much again, Josh, for joining us and for opening this session and for this opening the next 3 days. We're so grateful to have you here, and hopefully you can stick around for the rest of the morning. I'm now going to hand over to Karen Foley, who is the lead of the CCAT project. There's a question in the Q&A box that I think Karen will probably answer through her presentation, so that's why I haven't yet answered it. And so Karen, I will just share your slides for you.
Thank
if you
you.
give me 1 second.
And thank you for that question. It gives me a real reason to be here. One of the main reasons here is just to endorse Emma's welcome to you all. My name is Karen Foley. I'm a landscape architect. I'm an academic at University College Dublin. I have a particular interest in the coast. And thank you also for Josh's presentation, because he made it absolutely apparent that coastal communities are at the forefront of bearing the brunt of climate change, and how we all have to increasingly consider how to adapt to be more resilient and to deal with the coastal management planning decisions, as well as many others. As Emma said, this event grew out of our event last November, where we had, I think, over 170 people registered each day, and I think we're approaching these figures again today. So it is evident that there's an urgency about this topic. There's a desire to learn from others, and that's why we're all here again today, bringing a diverse range of practitioners and academics with expertise in policy, coastal management, climate change, adaptation. So Emma, if you go on to the next slide, this event is organised by CCAT, and what CCAT is an acronym that stands for Coastal Communities Adapting Together, and it's a pilot Interreg project funded under the Interreg Ireland-Wales programme and delivered by WIFO, which is the Welsh European Funding Office, in partnership with the Irish Southern Regional Assembly. And the focus of this particular pillar of Interreg was focusing on the Irish Sea and looking at bringing together scientific expertise to increase capacity and research into the effects of climate change. So you can see how well that brief fits into what we're actually presenting today. If you go to the next slide, Emma, we've 6 partners on both sides of the Irish Sea, which are there. You can see them listed at the bottom. UCD, we've got Cork as well. On the Welsh side, we've got Cardiff University. And then we have the coastal communities that we're working with in Fingal County Council, and also the Port of Milford Haven, Pembroke, and Pembrokeshire Coastal Forum are partners there as well. The main organiser of this event, this knowledge exchange event today, is Cardiff University, and my thanks go to Emma, who's been the driving force behind it. Now, CCAT, the research project, its objective was to build adaptive capacity to the impacts of climate change by improving knowledge flows and awareness of climate change impacts for the Irish Sea and its coastal communities. And CCAT itself, and we've talked a little bit about this in the earlier event, and there are other places you can find out more about it. One of the things we've been doing is participatory mapping and other digital and non-digital learning resources in both our communities in Portrane in North Dublin and also in Ireland, also Pembroke Dock and Milford Haven in Wales. And we've discovered that participatory mapping is a very appropriate mechanism because all climate change impacts and associated mitigation, they have a spatial dimension. And in that way, mapping is a very effective way of engaging with the community. So the web link to our research web page is at the bottom, and you can find out more about those projects if you move on to that. So Emma, just my final slide there. As Emma has said, over the next 3 mornings, we're covering a wide range of topics, nature-based solutions, the role of climate change, adaptation, and we'll also, probably most importantly, be hearing from coastal communities experiencing the impacts of climate change. We'll also hear the voice of young people and discuss the really relevant topic of eco-anxiety, which, I think we all need to be very sensitive to, those of us in our work and research life, and also as the Chancellor said, it's very timely too with COP26 on the very near horizon that we get the message out there on the importance of the research. And I think finally, I note the wide distribution of those signed up to this event. And obviously it is evident that adaptation to climate change and issues of coastal management have a very wide geographic spread. Our research under CCAT has had a specific Irish-Welsh focus, and Wales and Ireland are obviously the closest of neighbours. We have a very strong positive relationship built on age-old connections and a deep cultural understanding. Our geography means we have a common maritime history with the Irish Sea uniting us. And as researchers and as communities, it's with sadness, I suppose, we note the end of the Ireland-Wales Interreg projects, but we do take some comfort from documents that are currently emerging, such as the Ireland-Wales Shared Statement and Joint Action Plan, where cooperation has been set out for the next few years up until 2025. And these include both climate and sustainability and education and research. So I do remain confident, I'm a positive person, but new opportunities to support the valuable work that we're going to hear about in the next 3 days and that I hope we've contributed to under CCAT will be found. So Emma, with that, I'm handing back to you for more detail on the context of the event and what will be happening. Okay, thank you.
Hadn't unmuted myself. Thank you very much, Karen, for that introduction. Hopefully that answered the question about the scope of the CCAT work that was in the Q&A box from Jocelyn. There are, of course, opportunities for us to think about how we can move forward from the CCAT project. And as Karen, I think, alluded to, we are coming to the end of the CCAT programme. And so this is an opportunity not just to talk about all of the amazing work and the important work that's happening around climate change adaptation, both in Ireland and Wales and further afield, but also to think about what we do next. So we'd be really open to those conversations, whether it's in the chat box or whether there are people you want us to put you in touch with from the panel or conversations you'd like to have with the CCAT team. Please just let us know, and we can make sure to kind of make those contacts and support that networking. Thank you, Karen, for that introduction to CCAT. I'd now have the great privilege of introducing Professor Robin McInnes, who is going to speak to us and be essentially our opening keynote for the next 3 mornings. Robin is going to speak to us about his recent work exploring coastal erosion and climate change, guidance for policymakers, planners and stakeholders. Robin has a wealth of experience in this field, so we're really grateful that he was able to join us for this morning. Robin, give me 2 seconds and I will get your slides up for you as well. I have to make sure I don't share the same presentation twice. Give me just a second. Okay. You should be able to see that.
Yeah, we can see those.
Amazing. So Robin, I'll hand over to you. You are still muted, Robin. Robin, you're muted. We can't hear you. If I do that, you might. There we go. Yes, perfect. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, good. I'll hand back over.
Thank you. And I'm most grateful, Emma, of this opportunity to present the work on the new coastal erosion and climate change guide aimed at planners that I'm most grateful to Jacobs International Consultants who've kindly supported the preparation and publication of this guide, which is now widely available online. And before I start, I must also thank my co-author, Professor Roger Moore of Jacobs, and Chloe Stanford-Clark, who works with me, has worked on this project, doing a lot of the work on the case studies, the international case studies. So, well, climate change has had so much publicity recently. It's affecting all sectors of society in all regions of the world. Coastal erosion, landslides, flooding, the melting of ice caps, retreat of glaciers, forest fires, these have all been in the news. And it's a sad fact that globally, often it's the case that the people who have done the least to cause these problems are some of the most seriously affected. In my next slide, just talking about coastal zones. And I just wanted to say that, of course, coastal zones are enormously popular for many reasons, and many of these coastal areas have been intensively developed over time for tourism and for economic reasons, obviously. And in Europe alone, there's thousands of billions of pounds or euros worth of assets existing for tourism and, of course, for other economic regions and reasons. And if we turn to the next slide, equally, the less developed coasts may often be important heritage sites or be important and preserved for their natural environment. But equally, the undeveloped coasts are going to be affected in many ways, which could have adverse effects as well, although natural processes in many places will be allowed to continue. And in the next slide, Emma, over the last decade, as I say, public awareness of climate change has increased significantly with the news coverage that we've all received. The melting of the polar ice caps in particular, and glacial retreat, and projections for sea level rise, they're raising alarm amongst scientists and businesses and the general public, obviously. Now, if we can move on, what is being said about climate change and the latest projections? This is from the Committee on Climate Change 2018. So hotter, drier summers and warmer, wetter winters. More unsettled weather patterns, an increase in storm events, and this extraordinary weather that we've experienced over the last 2 or 3 years in particular. Sea level rise of up to a metre by 2100 for the low to medium emission scenarios, and up to 2.5 metres for extreme scenarios. And obviously these predictions are going to have significant consequences for many low-lying cities and communities and infrastructure located along the coast. And this is highlighted in more detail in our recently published guide. So just moving on, there's obviously a long-standing knowledge of changes on the coastal zones. There's many obvious examples. You can see in this Neolithic stone circle on the Brittany coast how part of the circle has been inundated. And just in the next slide, moving to the Isle of Wight, where I'm based, you can see in this old engraving from the 1840s how these stranded oak trees on the shore show the line of a previous coast. And again, in the next slide, on the southwest coast of the Isle of Wight, the whole of this village called Black Gang and the hill in the foreground has long since disappeared as a result of coastal change. So coastal change has been going on for years, but it's just that now the rate and scale of coastal change is likely to accelerate significantly because of climate change. And in this next diagram, which was actually prepared by the Department of the Environment some years ago, I think it fairly succinctly summarizes what we're looking at. On the left, we have in the blue ring, on the inner ring, human activity and present development. And on the right, the blue ring, landslide hazard. It could equally be for coastal erosion hazard or flood hazard, and present sea levels. And you can see the overlap between the two represents the risk. But if we look at the outer rings, future development and future sea level rise, you can see that the area of risk expands considerably. And this is the challenge that we have to look at addressing. So now let's turn to risks to coastal properties and infrastructure in the next slide. So again, going back to Committee on Climate Change, over 500,000 properties are located in areas of significant flood risk. 9,000 properties may be at risk from coastal erosion, but this figure may double by 2100. And a further 100,000 properties along soft cliff lines could become at increasing risk from coastal erosion and landsliding. And I'd like to say a few words about each of these topics, about coastal erosion, landsliding, and briefly flooding, although flooding is not a significant part of this new guide. But let's look at some examples from across the world. And of course, just in the UK, certain parts of our soft rock coastline are particularly prone to problems of coastal erosion, and North Norfolk coast is well known. Here you can see a photograph of an eroding coastal village, and in the next slide, after the storm surge in the North Sea in December 13, the landsliding that took place at the village of Hemsby. But if we look at abroad, lot of coastal infrastructure, highways, railways, and coastal businesses and residential properties are located in coastal zones. And so they are particularly vulnerable to the effects of increased coastal erosion, weathering, and landsliding. And in the next slide, we can see another example on the coast of Thailand, where almost a similar problem exists to that of North Norfolk and the slide I showed you in Portugal. But here we see an underestimation perhaps of the rate and scale of coastal erosion of soft cliff lines that can take place on the Australian Gold Coast of Queensland, and the dramatic consequences that this could have in terms of future management. In terms of landslides, let's have a look at some examples. Some people may remember the Holbeck Hall Hotel landslide at Scarborough in 1993, when the hotel was full and guests were sitting down to breakfast when this massive landslide occurred. And you can see in the next slide what the consequences of that were. And fortunately, no one was killed or injured in the slide, which was incredible, but it did lead to a major phase of study and investigations along soft rock coastlines that are prone to natural hazards, and also monitoring programs being introduced at some of the key sites around the British coast. And staying on the North Yorkshire coast, this next slide shows Caton Bay, which is typical of a number of small communities along that coastline where properties are located close to the top of soft cliffs. But landslides are a global problem that is increasing, and with the predicted increase in rainfall, in winter rainfall in particular, and greater intensity, where the geology is soft rock, such as here at the La Conchita landslide in California, you can see the consequences where development has been allowed to take place close to an unstable cliff line. And obviously, very sadly, there was loss of life in this case. And another example from the USA, again on the California coast near Los Angeles, Laguna Beach, this expensive holiday resort. You can see the results of landsliding in this particular case. Perhaps we can turn to France, and more recently in 2012 on the Normandy coast, on the upper Normandy coast between Dieppe and Le Tréport, just outside Dieppe, this site at Pourville, you can see a coastal landslide of some 400,000 cubic meters slipped from these cliffs, taking coastal properties with it. And most of the materials being washed away by the sea by the time this photograph was taken, but you can see one of the properties down over the cliff. And in the next slide, you can see how the French government has assisted in managing this problem by moving the road back away from the coast and acquiring the properties. And I'd like to say a little bit more about the French approach to coastal risk management and how this could help them adapt to climate change in miniature. Just back on the Isle of Wight now again. Here you can see a landslide at Totland Bay in 2012, and it makes the point that there are two factors obviously that promote landsliding. One is coastal erosion. In this case, the toe of the cliff was protected by a seawall, but it was aging, but also high groundwater levels. And by 2080, there's expected to be an increase in winter rainfall, perhaps during the months, particularly from September to December, of between 26 and 40%. So we have to think carefully about drainage arrangements and how drainage can be managed alongside the necessity for maintaining our coastal defence structures to a high standard. And just one more, if I may, from the Isle of Wight. This is another soft rock coastline at Sandown Bay, popular tourist resort. And here you can see a landslide behind a row of hotels in the town of Shanklin. And in the next slide, you can see how the landslide has filled a car park behind the hotels and causing damage to the property, actually moving one of the hotels forward. So we can expect a greater frequency of these kind of events, and obviously we need to be able to plan effectively to try and reduce the risks and also have good management systems in place. Now, I said I'd mention briefly about flooding, of course, and in the next slide here is one of familiar scenes that are regularly highlighted on the news, the effects of hurricanes and storms on the eastern seaboard of the USA. And often the coastline's quite low-lying and there's relatively limited coastal defences, often relying on natural beaches. And in the next slide, you can see the effects of Hurricane Arthur on one of these communities on the North Carolina coast in 2014. And I think it's making the point that it's not just poor countries that are affected by natural hazards, but there's the need for improvements in the way we manage the coast across all countries in the world, whether they be rich or poor. But one of the regions that has been and will be most seriously affected by climate change are the many small island developing states. And I remember attending the climate change summit in Copenhagen over a decade ago, and the small islands pleading for assistance at that time. And I'm afraid very little has changed really over the intervening period. But in the next slide, we can pick on one of the examples is the Maldives, which is an atoll of 1,190 islands, and of which perhaps a third of them are inhabited. And 80% of the land area is less than a metre below sea level. And if we look in the next slide, you can see that the management issues are very severe here, and this is the kind of situation that many of the local residents are finding themselves having to manage on a day-to-day basis. We're just turning to the guide again. I'd just like to highlight some of the case study sites. Obviously, I've talked a little bit about the Isle of Wight, but these are the sites that we've picked, and I'd like to just draw on one or two of those, if I may, to illustrate the kind of information that's provided in the guide. And in the next slide, I said I'd like to come back and talk a little bit about the French approach to coastal risk management and coastal planning, because I believe it is a useful model that can work well more widely. And this particular site is a town called Cllr, which is on the upper Normandy coast between Dieppe and Le Tréport. And the situation here is that, and if we can have the next slide, we have seaside development along the top of a high chalk cliff coastline, and shows again in the following slide. And as a result of some coast protection works further on the updrift side of the village, beach levels lowered along this particular frontage, which has a row of bungalows extending along to the north. And there was a rapid increase in coastal erosion. Now, in this particular location, the cliffs are of some environmental importance. It's a natural area, and there was no practical and economic solution to undertaking coast protection or cliff stabilization works. So in France, there is provision under a law called the Barnier Law, which was introduced by Michel Barnier when he was French Environment Minister in, I think, 1991. And the basic provision of the Barnier Law is that the mayor may declare an area unfit for habitation, and he or she can apply to the government for funding from the Barnier Fund to compulsorily purchase all properties that are affected in that part of the coastal zone, pay the owners of the properties the full market value, and then clear the area of the property to create a free coastal zone where natural processes can continue. So the MaREI fund is, in a sense, a tax because it's a surcharge of 6% on all property insurance and motor insurance in France, and this covers these situations arising from coastal erosion, landsliding, flooding, and mining subsidence. So it covers quite a broad field. So in the case of this particular site at Cllr, if you look in the next slide, you can see these are the properties that are being demolished to create a clear zone, allowing the natural processes of cliff erosion to continue. And in this diagram, perhaps I can explain it more easily. Here we have the eroding cliff affecting the red zone, where the risk zone 1, I've called it, where properties are being removed. Obviously, no new development would be allowed in that zone. Along the top, there's a scale which shows the estimated cliff retreat in years. It could be in meters, but so the second zone back, maybe 20 to 40 years, only minor alterations would be allowed to properties in that zone. Then the yellow zone, properties may still be improved, but no new developments allowed. And then the green zone is an area more suitable where new development might be allowed. In effect, property is rolling back from the coast. And I think the difference with the situation in France is that people are fully compensated, so there's not the same issues that some other countries have faced with difficulty persuading people to leave their properties in areas affected by such risks. The second case study I'd like to talk about is the southern coast of the Isle of Wight, which is an area called the Undercliff, which is the largest urban landslide complex in northwestern Europe. And I think it's recognised by the government as the most serious landslide problem in Great Britain. And it's an area 12 kilometres long with some 10,000 permanent residents, with a population that doubles during the summer period. And so if we look in the next slide, you can just see another view of the site, and you can see the wooded slopes and the more developed town of Ventnor in the distance, and the back scar of the landslide, which is up to 1 kilometre in width and, as I say, 12 kilometres in length. And in the next slide, this area has been well studied. It was a focus for the government when they were preparing their planning policy guidance for development on unstable land. There's been a detailed mapping of the area, producing large-scale maps which divide the area into risk zones, a bit like traffic lights, and these can inform the planning process and guide development away from the areas of greatest risk, and ensure that future problems of development in unstable sites don't take place. And as a result of both surface and subsurface investigations, this detailed model of the landsliding has been developed. It's an area where coastal defences have been upgraded, drainage has been improved, but as I mentioned earlier, rainfall is expected to increase significantly. So probably in order to maintain the status quo in terms of ground instability, reducing instability, it'll be necessary to carry out some form of more major drainage works in the next decade or 2 decades in order to prevent problems getting worse again. Just on the approach then, in the next slide, we held 3 international conferences around the subjects of landslide and climate change over the last 20 years. And this diagram sets out a model, if you like, for management of landslides, which has been quite widely taken up across the world now. And it could also be called components of a coastal risk management strategy. But the key components obviously are planning and building controls, both development plans and development control, the building regulations, which does also contain powers in relation to ground instability measures. Engineering, such as coastal defences, cliff stabilisation and slope protection and earthworks. And importantly, monitoring programmes. And a number of the key sites, for example, around the UK coast, such as the Isle of Wight and the Dorset coast at Lyme Regis and the Yorkshire coast and East Anglia and other locations, have now got quite sophisticated systems in place that help to monitor groundwater levels and ground movements and help understand these problems for the future. And just one more slide on Ventnor. For example, here's the instrumentation sites which are monitored within Ventnor town, annual GPS monitoring, which alongside readings from approximately 100 other instruments of various types help understand the situation in this very complex site. And this last slide about Ventnor is a diagram which has been quite widely disseminated. It's the do's and don'ts and guidance for property management for coastal residents. And some of the suggestions set out and advice provided seem fairly obvious, but and it's the fact that if one or two people implement these changes, it doesn't always make a huge difference. But if a whole community can get together and adapt and follow these kinds of good practice advice, then obviously that can make a huge difference. Now, just moving on to another site. This is the city of Portsmouth in Hampshire. And it's an interesting fact, I think, that Portsmouth is the only city in the UK that's more densely populated than London. And it's very low lying. It's built on a number of islands. And the coastal defences, the flood defences had reached the end of their life, and a major programme of upgrades has been ongoing for some time, probably costing of the order of £150 million, replacing seawalls. And you can see in this next slide the kind of work that's been going on. And this will hopefully protect the city into the future. If we can just move on to the next slide. And here you can see some of the flood defence walls being built round the back of the city in this case, in order to provide the necessary standard of protection for the next 100 years or so. So we can't, of course, continue to protect all areas, but there are some projects such as this major Environment Agency scheme at Medbury in West Sussex, where taking a fresh look at the site can create opportunities for major habitat gain, as well as also continuing to provide defence, but further back where necessary. So that's an important part of the coastal risk management strategy. So there's a lot going on in terms of looking forward to finding ways of managing the risks and understanding more about our changing coasts. And I'd just like to show you some examples of work that's been going on, and I'm sure many people will be fully aware of these documents. The Shifting Shores adaptation strategy that's being implemented by the National Trust very successfully. In Scotland, a huge piece of work providing the basis for shoreline management planning, establishing the coastal cells around the Scottish coast, and then having a really detailed look at what's happening in terms of flooding, coastal erosion, landslides, and future climate change predictions taking place. So that's a big step forward. And the work, of course, that's been ongoing for some time by Natural England, the National Character Assessments, which provide really excellent overviews of all the coastal zone management issues for the whole of this country. So I'd just like to conclude with a few statements which may seem very obvious, but there's obviously a lot more in the guide, and I do hope that you'll have the opportunity to have a look at it. So this wide acceptance that climate change and sea level rise is posing significant challenges for coastal communities across the world. And scientists have, I think, they've made big steps forward in terms of identifying those areas where there are particular problems. And the essential role of planning in this is fundamental. And one of the reasons for writing this guide and calling it a guide aimed at planners and policy makers is because in many countries of the world, planning is a statutory function, whereas coastal defence, coast protection is often discretionary, as it is in this country. Also, in England and Wales, for example, I suspect that the number of professional coastal engineers has dropped very significantly in recent years. And whereas, as I say, planning being a statutory function, with development plans, statements about coastal change management areas are being integrated into these documents. And so it's important to provide further information and raise awareness for the planning sector. And of course, the guide is aimed at stakeholders and politicians more widely. So there's huge challenges, financial and practical, in terms of climate change. But I wanted to end this presentation on a positive note that there are a lot of things going on. We've got this huge wealth of technical expertise across the world looking at these problems, but the urgency cannot be overstated, and we need the political will to invest in sustainable solutions to safeguard coastal areas from all the natural hazards that I've talked about. And I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robin, for such a great presentation. I think there's been a lot of interest, particularly in the global examples that you've brought into the discussion for today. So thank you for that really in-depth kind of introduction to some quite complicated topics and really looking at climate change from a real range of different perspectives. And I think you highlighted some of those kind of key messages that keep coming up time and time again. So it's around being proactive, so using the modelling, using the data and the science that we have to feed into our planning and decision making to make sure we're future-proofing our infrastructure and future-proofing our house building and the plans for our coastal spaces in the future. And I think you showed some real examples of the reality of climate change and what could and will happen to coastal places in the future and what those impacts might be. There were some examples, and actually, I forgot to mention when Josh was speaking, where Josh mentioned the shoreline management plans, and Robin, you mentioned MaREI as an example. Both of those things were covered in our event in 2020. So please, if anybody's interested, let us know and we can point you in the direction of those presentations as well. We do have a discussion panel at the end of this morning's session. So I'm going to ask Robin one of the number of questions that have come in, but we will come back to them. And then James, I'll bring you on for your talk, which I think would come in quite nicely since Dynamic Coast got a mention in Robin's talk. So that's a nice segue. And so Robin, there's been a lot of interest in the Q&A around the MaREI Fund. So there's a question from, I'm going to go with a question from Rachel, who said, under the French MaREI law, is there any provision to prevent people from buying up vulnerable coastal property to profit from potential subsequent full market value purchase?
That's a good question. I'm not sure of any examples that I know of myself about this, but I know that it's a very rigorously appraised and scrutinized process. And so I think that it's unlikely that that opportunity would exist.
That's good to know. I suppose that means that there's some safeguarding to prevent that kind of...
Yes, I'm sure that is the case, yes.
Yeah, to prevent that kind of, I guess, monopolization, opportunistic use of the markets.
Yes.
Yeah. Great, thank you. As I said, there are a number of questions for you in the Q&A. So if you'd like to go through them while we have the other speakers, please feel free. But we'll also be posing some more of them to you in the discussion session. So thank you again very much for your talk. And James, I'd like to bring you on now, please. So we'd like to welcome Dr. James Fitton from University College Cork and MaREI, and he is here representing Climate Ireland. So we're really grateful to have you here. Your screen is starting to share. I can
hear me and you can see the screen.
I can see your screen and I can hear you. Brilliant. Thank you, James.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emma. Good morning, everyone. My name is James Fitton. I'm from University College Cork, and specifically from MaREI, which is the Centre for Energy and Climate and Marine, based within UCC. And today I'm going to be talking about Climate Island predominantly, and this is a climate service that's been developed over the last few years to support climate change adaptation and action. But just also a little bit from Scotland as well. And Robin introduced Dynamic Coast there, which is a project that I worked on, which is a bit more focused on the coast, obviously. So I'll be pulling in some examples from Ireland and Scotland in terms of the work that can be that's been done to support climate change adaptation. So firstly, climate change, Climate Island. This is a web portal, climateisland.ie, and this provides information, advice and support to help Ireland adapt to climate change. And we do this in a number of ways. We have sort of three approaches. We have supporting decision making, which is that providing information side of the platform. Awareness and capacity building. This is training, engagement with specifically local authorities and the sectors, and support the development of climate policies. On the website Climate Island, we have a lot of information that essentially takes you by the hand in terms of what is climate change and through to the different approaches to dealing with adaptation through, different approaches to dealing with climate change through climate adaptation, and some of the issues that might come up in relation to things like uncertainty with regard to projections. And so this is a valuable resource for local authorities and for the sectors, which is the prime sort of target for Climate Island. However, it is publicly available, so it is obviously available for anyone to go on and to read further information about climate change to get that basic understanding of some of the concepts about climate change that's required sometimes. We also have a number of tools, which is what we find are more sort of research specific outputs that we get from various different projects. But one of the main tools that's developed over the last 5 years is a portal for to allow people to map spatially and see climate observations for Ireland and also the climate projections. So people can have a look at how the climate was in the past. You can click and see different graphs for this information, and then also look into the future as well. What are the climate projections saying in relation to temperature and heat waves, precipitation, dry days, wind speeds, and various other climate variables. And this is sort of what Climate Island specialises in. You can describe Climate Island as essentially a climate service, and a climate service is a way to translate high-level, quite detailed information, data, and turning it into information that is very easy and accessible for, in this case, local authorities and the sectors. So sectors being like transport, energy, water, but also for the public, because a lot of this information is developed from that more academic background, which is delivered in ways that isn't necessarily the most accessible for public and the communities. So this is what Climate Island specialises in, is turning that more inaccessible sort of data into accessible information. A second tool that's been recently developed based upon the Climate Status Report for Ireland, which was a report undertaken by the EPA in Ireland, funded by the EPA. And this is a report that you can go on. It's a very lengthy report. There's wealth of information within this document. However, it's not the most easiest to read in terms of this more data-driven side of this climate information. So what we did, we developed the climate status tool. So if you go to climateisland.ie, you'll be able to go to this tool. And this is an interactive way to engage with the information that's been in the report, essentially. And we have this graphical interface that allows you to essentially zip around all these different types of climate variables from both the atmosphere and the cryosphere, although the cryosphere isn't much to do in Ireland, but also surface ocean physics, ocean geochemistry, subsurface ocean physics, terms that are quite complex, but once you click on these sort of variables, there is a short explain about what it is, why it's pertinent to to Ireland, and also why it's important to monitor this information. And then a short description about the trends that have occurred within this climate variable. So you can see trends over time, sort of sea surface temperature in this instance. And so this provides, again, a more accessible way to access this information and provide it in a way that is more accessible for communities and the public, but also local authorities and the sectors. And if you need further information, you can obviously then go back to the main report and documentation. Another output that's been developed recently and is currently still in development is the Social Vulnerability Index for islands. One of the concepts about climate risk is that we're dealing with, firstly, the hazard, so flooding or your coastal erosion, and then an asset that is exposed, whether that's a residential property or a railway. But there's also this third component, which is vulnerability, essentially how susceptible are these people, how sensitive to the hazard are people. And what you find is that there is difference in people's sensitivity and ability to cope and respond to hazard events. And this is based a lot of the time in relation to their socio-demographic characteristics and economics. So things like low income, poor health, poor engagement with the community, all these sorts of ideas can all contribute to elevating a vulnerability. And we can use census data to try and map this idea spatially. This has been done in Ireland by ourselves on Climate Island, but there is similar work in both Scotland and England and Wales in terms of index of multiple deprivation. And also Sarah Lindley out of Manchester has been doing similar work in terms of mapping social vulnerability for hazards. And this is a really important step, I think, in terms of thinking about how we manage at the coast, specifically in this context as well. There's a recent report in England that came out about how coastal towns are hotspots for poor health and inequality. And so this is a particular issue within the coastal communities, that these are areas where we will see elevated social vulnerability to hazards in comparison to other places in the country. And so it is important that we do map these concepts and start to implement them and use them within our planning of adaptation. And so it's useful for finding the areas of people that are vulnerable, but also informing the way that you can adapt to places. One of the examples that this similar work's been used in volcanic areas to minimize impacts from volcanoes is the fact that early warning systems, and if you've got an elderly population, they might not be as used to using smartphones or the internet as other parts of the population, and therefore you have to specifically come up with ways to reach these sorts of people. But it also feeds into the idea of climate justice, that we shouldn't be leaving anyone behind in climate adaptation. We should be bringing everyone with us. And a lot of the time that means that we need to focus on areas of high vulnerability to ensure that these people are properly addressed and looked after and are able to adapt as we go forward over the next 10, 20 years in terms of the impacts of climate change. In terms of the building capacity aspect of the work that Climate Island does, and I think Josh has really introduced this concept really well for this point, is that local authorities are very much at the forefront of adaptation to addressing the impacts of climate change. And the local authorities are key to addressing huge amounts of aspects in relation to that just transition and also health and well-being of places. And one of the things that we wanted to do, and we worked with the CAROs, which is the Climate Action Regional Offices in Ireland, to develop a course, an online training course to deliver to local authority staff, all local authority staff, regardless of their role within the organisation, to raise awareness about climate change and what the local authority can do to address climate change. So that we have 3 modules, the first being the science of climate change effectively, the second looking at the policies that are in place, both in terms of the EU and national policies, and what the role of the local authority is. And part of that module is that local authorities in Ireland have signed up to the Climate Action Charter, and part of that charter very much is pushing this idea of engaging with communities, specifically the public participation network. So these are local community groups, to both be informed by climate change action, but also implement climate action and use these communities to deliver action that is suitable for these communities. And the module 3 there, delivering climate action, a lot of the time that local authorities sometimes feel that they're not really in a position to influence a lot of what goes on in their sort of jurisdiction, beyond just what the local authority has responsible for. But there's ideas about green procurement, ensuring that only the greener or more environmentally friendly resources are purchased by the local authority, for example, are ways that the local authority can really engage and deliver climate action within the community. And this course has proved very popular. We've had 12,000 people enrolled, with another 4,000 being enrolled at the start of the year, at the start of next year, and has received very good feedback in terms of the information that's been delivered. So although that is focused on local authority, I think it's important for the communities to understand that the aim of the local authority here is to ingrain climate change in a way that health and safety was ingrained within organisations. It's something that is done on a day-to-day basis. And when a community goes to a local authority to talk about a particular issue, that they are not just met with blank faces in the local authority. They do understand the science of climate change, and also the possible actions that can be taken to address their concerns. And in Climate Ireland, we have the future direction is to focus on these different aspects of climate change risk. So we have that hazard, which is that science of the physical properties of the processes, and also that vulnerability in terms of the socioeconomic, societal side of climate change as well. There is also ongoing work in Ireland funded by MaREI, which is associated with standardising the national climate projections for Ireland, and also developing further climate service to essentially use these standardised outputs. So it's similar to the UK CP18 sort of output or idea, but over the next few years, these information or these data will be output. So this is just a flag to anyone that's potentially interested that there is a lot of work that's going on behind the scenes. This project just started a few months ago, so we're hot off the press in terms of that work. So that was some of the services and the outputs available within the Irish context. And Climate Ireland is focused on climate change in general, but obviously it has associated outputs that can be used by coastal communities. However, I just wanted to highlight a piece of work that has been undertaken in Scotland, the Dynamic Coast Project, and Robin briefly introduced it in the previous talk. This was some work that I've been involved in since 2016, since when it first started. And the aim of this work was to essentially map where the coast was changing in Scotland. And it was to create a national database, a national coverage of coastal change. And in the first instance, we used historic maps from the 1890s and 1970s to map the location of the coast, and then compare it to where it is today, being defined by digital elevation models or outputs from the Ordnance Survey. Over the last few years, the second phase of Dynamic Coast has been undertaken, and it was launched and finalised in August of this year. And off the back of that work, the Scottish Government has provided £12 million worth of investment to support local authorities to prepare their coastal adaptation plans. And this demonstrates the power of research, demonstrating that there is an issue, and then feeding it back into policy and action within the local government. And this work was undertaken and funded by the Scottish Government and CRU, and delivered by University of Glasgow in association with Nature Scot, previously Scottish Natural Heritage and St Andrews Links. And as part of that work, we have a website, so dynamiccoast.com, And on that website, you'll find a variety of outputs. And as I say, we've tried to make the outputs available to a range of different end users, going from that science academic background, but also more community or public facing side of way. So we have the website, which you can go on, and we have a number of sort of general reports, national reports that sort of summarize various aspects of the project, but we also have focused on a number of super sites. So these deal with a particular issue. For example, we have one from Cllr Bray in Orkney, the World Heritage Site, so looking at that cultural archaeological heritage side of thing, but also we have golf courses in there as well, in terms of their importance to a lot of communities, particularly the Links golf course in the smaller towns in Scotland. Sector-specific report cards, so if you're working in transport or water, short little snippets of information. And we have web maps and spatial data that can be accessed for that, basically going around and having a look at the information for your area of particular interest. And we also have academic articles as well, open access academic articles. Well, one of the outputs that I want to just focus on, because I think it's well, a pretty nifty piece of work, but I also think it has value to a lot of coastal communities, is Coast X-ray. And this is an Earth observation product or output, and this used 5 years of Sentinel-2 imagery. Sentinel-2 is a number of satellites that takes images of Scotland and the UK about once every 4 to 5 days. And we tidally calibrated using a tidal model to say, if we had an image, we could see what the tide was in this image. And using that tidally calibrated 5 years worth of data, we could start to map the intertidal area across the UK and Ireland. Even though this was funded by Scotland, I wanted to ensure that this was available cross-border. So it covers the UK and Ireland, so the whole of the region. Therefore, we can use different, it doesn't matter where you're from within this region, you can access this data. It has an online app which allows you to easily access this information. I think this is the key in terms of the idea of services to support communities. Earth observation is a very difficult thing to access for a lot of people, both in terms of the expertise and also the computing power required to do it. But this app that we've developed allows you to easily see a range of different outputs, but also look at the raw data and the imagery. So if you click on a location, you will end up with a graph like that you can see on the right, but you can also then click on that point in the chart and it will bring in the image associated with that particular time and date and tide. And so this is about making information that is previously inaccessible to a lot of people actually more accessible to then be used in various different ways in terms of coastal adaptation. So in summary, Climate Ireland provides a range of valuable services to support climate action. Say we are targeted at local authorities and the sectors, but by its very nature of being publicly available, it is open to communities to use as well. And I hope I've demonstrated that climate services, this idea that we distill and collate science, data, research into accessible and usable information, is key to supporting the implementation of climate action. And a recent piece of work by Lazarus and others highlighted this need to have, for the UK in this instance, to have an open data portal to allow people to access these sorts of information. And I think one of the issues is that we've very much been in a case of a lot of talking, a lot of planning, but we really do need to start supporting implementation of action on the ground. And hopefully we can help communities do that through our work in Climate Ireland and also in Scotland. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James, so much for such a great presentation and for really highlighting kind of how science and data and research can be used to support decision making and planning, and how we think about what that means for policy and climate adaptation in the future. I think you brought in some really crucial points that we've probably drawn upon in the previous event and we'll explore further in the next couple of days around climate justice and social vulnerability and health and well-being. And we were kind of eating into break time, but there was a question that came in from Eugene, which I had the similar kind of question. I thought it was brilliant to see. I wrote down, it's amazing to see the uptake for the local authority training. And I thought, you know, what have the challenges to that been? And Eugene put a question saying, let me just find it. So if 12,000 people enrolled in the training, which, let's be honest, somewhere the size of Ireland with the local authorities, that's a lot of people. So is there change happening within the objectives of regional local area plans to engage with real climate actions? Or is there a risk that that engagement in capacity building and training is an indication of tokenism to kind of show that people are engaging? Kind of, have you seen the impact, I suppose, of that training?
Yeah, I mean, it is a very good question. I think the impact of the training is probably a bit too soon to say in terms of the real on the ground training, but a lot of the comments we got back from the feedback was essentially that they felt that they're a lot of comments came back as they thought the courses, before they'd taken it, was going to be very preachy and very sort of, you know, climate change is this, and this. But actually, a lot of the comments actually said how they can actually, as a result of the course, see how they can bring climate change and climate change action into their day-to-day role, even though they might not necessarily be associated with planning or anything specifically. So I think there is definite shift how many of that 12,000 we'll see in terms of actually how it's done. But there are the local authorities in the phase of developing climate action teams, and they're smaller groups within the local authorities, and I think there is a massive demand coming from those teams as well for further training. There's additional training that's already been done for them, but there is a lot of demand for additional training by people for climate action.
Thanks. I think that really is a great kind of point, and the fact that I suppose it's still quite early days to kind of really see that impact. But I loved what you said in your talk around making climate change and climate adaptation part of the everyday, and making it part of how we see health and safety. It's just part of our thinking, and integrating it across the board so that it's not a separate thing. It brings in that need to think in an interdisciplinary, cross-sector and cross-policy way, that climate change links to health and well-being, links to infrastructure, links to transport. It's all connected. And I think that's a really crucial point to make and to think about as we continue our efforts to address climate change. Thank you so much for such a great talk. With that, we are 5 minutes over slightly. So what I'm going to do is I still want everybody to have their 5 minutes break, or their 10-minute break. So thank you so much to all of our speakers so far. We have another 3 speakers before our discussion panel. So I'd like to say that we all have a 10-minute break. So if our panelists, please mute yourselves, switch your cameras off, and we'll be back for 11:35. So 9 minutes, 9-minute break. So thank you all again. I will see you very shortly. Everybody. Oh, thanks, Pauline. Hi, everybody. I hope you had time to grab yourself a tea, a coffee, whatever you would do to have a break. I hope it wasn't checking emails, which is what I did. I'd like to welcome our next speaker of this morning. So we've heard from Climate Ireland, and as Karen explained to you at the beginning of today's session, we are a project that focuses on the Irish and Welsh coast. So we thought we wanted to have a view of what's happening from a climate adaptation perspective on both sides of the Irish Sea. So looking towards COP26, as I said, and getting insight from Climate Ireland, but also from Climate Cymru. So I'd like to welcome Adava, who will be speaking to us about the work that Climate Cymru are doing and really getting us thinking about the run up to COP26 over the next few weeks. So Izzy, over to you.
Hi everyone, good morning. I'm just going to share my screen in a bit.
We'll stay on so you know you've shared your screen, okay?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you fine.
Okay. All right, then just, okay, we go in there. Okay.
Well, I still have your slide panel and your
Can you see my screen now, Emma?
I can see your screen, but I can see your whole PowerPoint page. So it's not shared the presentation mode yet.
Oops. Do we have it now?
Yeah, but if you just go to display settings, yeah, and switch it around, and then we won't be able to see your next slide, and then people will get more of your. So just to display settings in the middle of your presenter mode, go up, over to the middle, display settings.
Uh-oh.
A bit to the right again.
I'm just going to run through.
Okay, no worries. You go for it. That's no problem.
Yeah, I'm unable to resolve it, but hey.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. So interesting that I come in with a lot of drama this morning, don't you think? I'm glad that the brains of the science have gone ahead of me. And so hopefully my work here is quite done, almost done. I am an ambassador with Climate Cymru. My name is Eze, like Emma said, and it's interesting. I also live in the coastal areas, one of the coastal areas in Wales, and because of the session title, which is the climate change on the coast, I thought to think around the implications of living in a coastal area in a changing climate. More often than not, I don't like to. There's always that off chance that there's someone in the audience who, even though this has been, climate change is a buzzword and it's used every day, there's always a chance that we really don't know what it means when we are asked the nitty-gritty of it. So I'll just start off with something that I hope is generic enough to be basic and encompassing enough to be quite scientific. So climate change basically just refers to significant changes in global temperature and precipitation and wind patterns and other things used to measure climate, which occur over a long period of time. And in our realities, we've been seeing the effects of the changes in our temperature and weather outputs over time. We've been experiencing those effects in more recent times. What are the implications of climate change in coastal areas? This opinion is a mixed bag of global and local. For instance, current projections in Wales shows that there is an 11% there's an 11% chance, or there's a chance that 11.3% of land in Wales will be at risk of flooding from rivers or the sea. And this projections previously was about 9.8%. And while the difference in figure may seem slight, if climate change has taught us anything, it is that the slightest figure could embody the biggest effects. We see that while scientific reports tell us, oh, we've seen 1.5 or so increase in temperature over a number of years on Earth, we have seen what that translates in extreme weather events around the world. And so if projections in Wales is looking like this, it's increasing, and we're seeing some difference in it. I think it portends a lot of things, because when we translate what 11.3% of land in Wales will look like, I'm sure it'll be mind-blowing when we translate it to relatable figures down the road. And so that gives a sense of urgency to people who live around the areas. First, there's an increase. So the risk of flooding is increasing. And then the outcome of that also is something that is quite scary, basically. According to Minister Julie James, the Minister for Climate Change, she was quoted recently in a BBC report saying that flood risk and coastal erosion in Wales is increasing as a result of climate change. And it is also, she also continued to say that the pattern of flooding around Wales is changing and getting worse. That is not comforting. That is not comforting for me as someone who resides in one of the coastal areas here. And I also did see a lot of flooding reported, I think, earlier in the year and late last year in and around the area, and we see what that translates into loss of properties, into loss of economic livelihoods and all of that. And so recently I saw a research from Bangor University, which portends that which says that climate change will impact future water availability for hydropower and public water supply in Wales. When that will be, well, it may seem far from now, but we are living a future of a yesterday. I'm sure some predictions have come through in our time, in our realities, which were from time that may have seemed far from when these predictions were made. And so, while it may sound far out, I personally have learned to say that it's not really far. You know, when all you need to do is set targets and timelines, and you see that these things are not really far at all. We look at global goals like 2030, for instance. 2030 seemed far out, far into the future a few years ago. And when there was the UN high-level meeting on climate change, I think in 2019 or thereabouts, it was just 11 years. Now we're down to 8 years and some months to 2030. And so the future is not always as far as we think it is. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Generally, some of the other implications of living in coastal areas is the risks that are posed by sea level rise and continued coastal flooding. And of course, if the area is already predisposed to coastal storm, well, it increases the predisposition of the area. And warmer climates can be harmful to aquatic lives. It can mean unconducive outdoors. I'm sure I can get witnesses in this room today who can attest to some interesting part of the summer where we had some really uncomfortable week or two where everything was just hot and uncomfortable. And unfortunately, it looks to be the trend that we're going into going forward. I'm not sure there's anything drastic that we can do right now to help us. Again, it's time-based. Well, continuing on implications of climate change in coastal areas, it poses risks when you go into the finer details of it. It poses risks to public health, safety, and some public infrastructures, economic well-being, among others. It's not all doom and gloom. A lot of efforts are being made to see that we mitigate, we adapt, we manage the entire process of climate change. But the question is, are we doing enough? And let's see what is being done so far. In Wales, for instance, the Walsh government declared a climate emergency in 2019. Wales has been a frontliner in the race to manage climate change. For example, it currently ranks second in Europe and third in the world for waste recycling. Well, it's part of many efforts towards mitigation and adaptation, and I'm not delving into the science of climate change and climate change mitigations and adaptations at this time. I'm kind of skimming around things because I'm really coming from the advocacy point of view and building on into that. The government has set carbon emissions targets. It is pledged to cut down emissions to zero by 2050. And in a UK first, developers in Wales now must consider a potential future flood or coastal erosion due to global warming in planning developments that they do. Now I've talked a lot about what the government should do, what should the government do, what is the responsibility of the government, but what is our responsibility as citizens, as people who live in these places, whose realities can get altered by any of these extreme weather events that are occasioned by climate change? Well, while we may not be the ones in government, while we may not be the ones who are the decision makers, we can reach out to them. We can send our opinion. We can guard our voices and send our opinion on agreed stance and strategies. It may seem that the government is doing quite a lot. It may seem that the government is busy doing something, but it's not enough. We're in a climate emergency, and so we need to gather our voices and keep reminding the government of its responsibilities, keep the government on its toes about what it has committed to do and what it should do. And in comes Climate Cymru. Climate Cymru is an advocacy platform which gathers and collates Welsh voices to the Welsh government. What's the purpose of Climate Cymru? The purpose of Climate Cymru basically is to apply democratic pressure on Welsh and UK governments, especially to make meaningful evidence-based and fair commitments at COP26. COP26 is the hottest item on the agenda currently because it's one of the key mobilizing moments around climate and climate change. And so in the past year and intensively over the past 10 months, Climate Cymru has been working seriously towards increasing the voices that call on the government to make sure that it makes more substantial commitments. It ups its commitment to climate change. And given that COP26 is a key mobilizer moment, all our efforts have been garnered towards that. We have been collating and collecting voices towards this as well. So what's the basic principle of Climate Cymru? The principle that we work with in Climate Cymru is a personalized principle because we think it engenders a sense of ownership in the advocacy efforts. And this personalized principle says that I believe that climate and nature emergencies require urgent actions. These actions should be guided by the best available evidence and the voices of people across Wales. And so what do the people of Wales care about? What is the potential impact of this? One of the other outcomes of Climate Cymru has also been increasing knowledge around climate change. We have had a lot of activities in the year, the most recent being part of the Great Big Green Week events. It's a week-long event that happens across all of the UK, and it helps us to increase knowledge among citizens, among people around climate change, and it also helped us to mobilize voices when people understand better what it is about and understand better what their role is. They're able to either sign on to add their voices to be able to pressure the government to say, you're going to COP26. We know you're going to have some negotiations. We know you're going to make some verifiable claim, hopefully, about what you've been doing about the climate and climate change around Wales and your commitment to it, but we want more because we are in an emergency, so we cannot rest on our oars. What's the impact of the advocacies? Again, the politicians need to be reminded that the people care. They care about the climate, they care about the environment that they live in, and they are very vested in the well-being and in the outputs or the outcomes of the climate and the environment where they live in. Climate Cymru has been inspiring and educating people around climate change, and what people can do as parts of efforts to raise awareness to what all our responsibilities are as citizens and and also to the government. It also gives voices to people who typically don't get heard because we're collecting the voices. It's personalized. It's on the website. I'm sure at the end of my presentation, there's a link to sign up. So it's personalized. You actually tell us what it is you want to see around climate change in Wales. And of course, it's also raised the profile, or rather it's raising the profile of COP26 around as well. Well, COP26 has been a big part of our campaign this year, so I just tend to put it in my presentations. What's the legacy that we are looking at as Climate Cymru? We hope that the advocacies that we have been engaging in and will continue to engage in post COP26 will help speed up the transition to net zero in Wales and around the world. Make sure, we also hope that our legacies will help make sure that the transition considers the voices of the communities and organizations as we move forward in this, being that it is something that affects all of us. And so I think we also want to engender that sense of ownership. Our target when we started was to raise 10,000 voices that we will take to COP26. And as at this moment, we have surpassed that, and it's still counting because we're still collating as many voices as possible between now and the beginning of COP. I think we've gathered over 10,300 voices, but your voice is powerful as a participant today, and we hope to hear your voice in Climate Cymru as we take your voices down to Glasgow in a couple of weeks or a few days to speak with our leaders and engage with them out there. So please add your voice. It is climate.cymru /add your voice. We hope to get some new sign-ons. We hope to read and see what it is you want to see around climate change, what you want government to do around climate change, how you want government to be better in its efforts towards managing, mitigating, combating, at whatever the word now. We want to hear you. We want to take your voice with us as we go to Glasgow in a few weeks. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Izzy, for your talk and for introducing us to the efforts and the work that Climate Cymru have been engaging with over the last few months and continue to really think about. I think crucially, there were some really interesting points that you raised around diverse voices and making sure that everybody has a role and a voice within these conversations. And I think that's a really big part of what we've been trying to do through CCAT, and that we'll see in some of the projects that we'll hear from over the next 3 days. And the idea of creating that ownership for climate adaptation and climate change. And I think that speaks to some of the work that we've done in CCAT around concepts of climate citizenship and those sorts of ideas. I'm loving that people have said multiple times, no doom. I'm not all doom and gloom. So I really am quite grateful for that. It's nice to hear that. Before we move on to our next speaker, Jean-Francois has put his hand up to ask an actual question. Jean, are you going to come on? Jean-Francois, are you going to come on screen and ask a question in real life? That would be amazing. You should do that.
Actually, no, it was a mistake. Sorry.
I was all excited. I thought we were going to have some real life interaction there.
Apologies.
That's okay. I'll forgive you. It's fine. Never mind. I guess really to come back to those ideas of community engagement, and crucially, I think COP26 not as an end point. It's actually the start. It's the start of these conversations, right? It's where we need to really springboard from and use it as a platform for action moving forward. And I think there's a comment from Greg in the Q&A who said that there's been conversations around the risk of increased flooding and the issues around climate change for numbers of years, and particularly from the UK context and things like the shoreline management plans. And nothing is fundamentally different from those projections. We've kind of known that for quite a long time. How do we make that urgency happen? How do we operationalize that urgency, do you think, and move away from we need more monitoring? Of course we need the monitoring, but how do we really make that urgency clear and take that forward?
Okay, so again, you can only do so much, yeah? But as an advocate over many years at all levels, high, low, medium level, think of it, one of the things that can help drive urgencies is the political will drive urgencies if you have that. And that's one of the reasons why COP is such an avenue, because a key mobilizer moment. You have all the leaders in the world now saying, okay, we have a climate emergency. What do we want to do? What's our commitment? But after all said and done, after we've done the follow-ups, we've done the photo-ops, and they're gone back to their countries. How do they follow through? Because again, as much as we would criticize this, there are other legitimate competing claims. Think of people coming from the global south. They've got a lot more, they have other things to compete with. Other competing claims back at home, economic, security, and all of that. Come to the west, the global north. They are fighting an extended battle with the COVID and the impact of the COVID. So you have a lot of competing claims. The question is, how do you get the climate agenda on the table and make it a front burner and all that? So it's usually sustained engagement. And the truth is, it's not a walk in the park. It's a long walk to freedom, because at some point your voice will be drowned out by the competing claims. But if you can have a group of motivated people, there will be times when they will be demotivated. Hello, motivate yourselves again. So just sustain the engagement, find your engagement points, sustain the engagement, be the low-hanging fruits. It doesn't have to be the big investment, the big investment purse things. I have had reasons to write to my MPs around here. I've had reasons to organize meetings where some of them have graced the meeting. And another thing is, when you're talking to the leaders, to the politicians, they give you politically correct answers. Oh, we're doing this, we're committed to this, you need to measure it. A quick example, and I'll yield the floor again. During the Great Big Green Week event that I organized in Bangor here, our member of Senate who attended, Shen Gwenli, when she came to attend the event, she was actually being climate conscious. She came by bus instead of driving down, and she made some personal commitments. Oh, if I have to go to the parliament and I can afford to, I'll take the train instead of, any other thing. So you have those pockets of wins. And the more we get those, hopefully we can snowball into a lot more commitment, pockets of commitment snowballing into something major and huge, but it's a long walk to freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Extra points for everybody who got that political reference at the end. Long walk to freedom. Thank you so much, Izzo, for telling us about Climate Cymru. And I think that very passionate call for sustained engagement really echoes some of the messages that we heard in our last event around the need to really work with our communities and stakeholders and to continue that conversation. It's not an endpoint, it's a process, and it's something that we need to invest in and have the resources for. So thank you very much for that kind of conclusion. Izzy will be around for the discussion session later, so please do put any more questions that you might have for her in the Q&A box. And I would like to now introduce Dr. Cormac Walsh, who is an independent researcher and consultant, who's going to take us away from the Irish Sea and away from Ireland and Wales and the UK and tell us a little bit about what's happening in other places. So Cormac is going to talk to us about climate adaptation and nature conservation at the German North Sea coast. So Cormac, I will stay on so I can make sure that you're sharing slides and we can hear you. That looks good. Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma. And yeah, I have a hard act to follow here. As Emma mentioned, I will be shifting the perspective to the German North Sea coast. I know this event is about exchanging knowledge and best practice, and my disclaimer at the beginning that this is not just best practice, but nevertheless, I think there are significant transferable lessons which can be taken from the German experience at the North Sea, Wadden Sea coast as well. What I will present is based on my own research over a period of more than 3 years, which was funded by the German Research Foundation when I was based at the University of Hamburg. Okay, so at the North Sea coast of Germany, we have a World Heritage Site, the Wadden Sea, which is recognized internationally as an ecological area of global importance. But it's also a man-made landscape with a 1,000-year history of coastal defense and land reclamation. So a very long history of engineering works, building dikes essentially, and also a history of catastrophic storm floods in the Middle Ages primarily, but which is still very much a strong feature in the collective memory, if you like. So one way of looking at it is that there has been a very long history of protecting civilization, farming communities from the wild sea in front of the dikes. And it's really only since the 1980s that the perspective has shifted to how do we protect the nature of the Wadden Sea from the destructive influence of human society. So this paradigm shift has occurred, if you like, and of course climate adaptation, the recognition that climate change will impact on both this natural ecosystem and land and livelihoods on the coast complicates matters and makes these discussions more challenging, if you like. So the area that I'm focusing in this talk is on Schleswig-Holstein, that portion of the Wadden Sea coast in the northwest of Germany, so close to the Danish border. Where I am in Hamburg is down at the it's just off the map, if you like, in the bottom right-hand corner. Just for orientation. Okay, so as I mentioned already, this is very much a man-made coast, and this is how it is perceived as well, with a very sharp boundary line between a natural landscape and what is really a reclaimed polder landscape behind the dikes. So this is, and you can see here the geometric shapes compared to this more dynamic landscape in front of the dikes. And this boundary is symbolically very, very important and informs policy debates, and that we have nature on one side and culture on the other side. And this was something that I looked at in my research in a lot more detail, which I won't go into today. Much of this tension really came to a head in the 1980s and 1990s with discussions around a Wadden Sea National Park, where there were very different perspectives and really a polarized debate on these issues, where from one side the Wadden Sea was seen as an area of global importance, really, a natural ecosystem, for some a pristine wilderness. And from the perspective of the local communities, many argue that no, this is really a man-made land which has been lost to the sea in times past, and there are actually a number of settlements which essentially were lost to the sea in catastrophic storm floods. So there are very different perspectives here at play, which influence current discussions in the context of climate change as well. Nevertheless, in 2015, the relevant authorities, they managed to produce a joint long-term strategy for the Wadden Sea with a time horizon of 2100, looking at the impacts of climate change, first of all. And what was really significant here was this included the national park authorities, but also the engineers responsible for coastal protection. So they had to find a common language, if you like, and they needed to come together and find a common perspective. Because they realized there was a risk, first of all, that the Wadden Sea itself would become smaller, decrease in size due to rising sea levels. So there was a need to find ways to allow the processes of sedimentation and accretion of sand to keep pace with the rising sea levels. So allowing mudflats, islands, and sandbanks to grow with anthropogenic sea level rise. And for the coastal engineers, they really saw this landscape as an important energy conversion zone, a buffer in front of the dikes, where the energy of the waves and the storm floods would be lessened before it hits the coast. So there was a common interest here to really have a joint strategy, but this was nevertheless still very difficult to find a common perspective. And what came out of this process, however, was a focus on sand nourishment at a very large scale. And this hasn't been implemented at this wide scale of the Wadden Sea to date. And there were a number of caveats as well from the nature conservation side. So first of all, I said, okay, yes, we can accept that this should happen, but it needs to occur outside of the national park boundary only, because we don't want any human interventions within the national park boundaries themselves. So from there, the natural flows of the ecosystem, the Wadden Sea, need to take the sediment to where it should go to. And secondly, the quantity of sand nourishment can only compensate for anthropogenic sea level rise and cannot go any higher than that. And of course, the coastal engineers, they like certainty, they like quantifiable indicators. They need to know that this is going to work. And they were, I think, scratching their heads and, and saying, there's a huge amount of uncertainty here. How do we know that this will compensate for anthropogenic sea level rise and nothing else? How do we know that the sand and sediment will end up in the right place? And of course, there's a very cost-intensive process as well. So they need to make sure that it does what is intended. So these are some of the challenges. The conservationists, they were very much sticking to their principles of letting nature be nature, as it's termed. And they say, yeah, we are not bringing the sediment in because we think that's a good idea. No, we are doing that. We're giving the Wadden Sea the chance to bring it to where it should go itself. So this was an important ideological distinction from the conservation perspective. And there are still very significant challenges within this context, particularly around the barrier islands. Here you can see the island of Sylt, an island with approximately a population of 15,000 and huge numbers of visitors every summer. And here the question really is, should the islands be fixed in place, or does dynamic adaptation in the long term make sense? And this will be about allowing sand dunes to migrate more naturally, and to allow for accretion on the lee side of the island, that the island would actually shift position over time. But this is a very significant cultural change, and it impacts on the rights and responsibilities of landowners very much. And there's significant opposition to even countenancing this type of approach in the long term. A lot of the discussion currently on the mainland coast is still about strengthening and raising the heights of dikes, but there is a recognition that there may be some limitations to this, and in some places the land behind the dikes is actually up to 9 meters below the level of the sea at high tides. So in some cases it may be that it's technically still okay to do this, but the coastal communities increasingly don't feel safe behind the dikes under these conditions. So there is discussion about alternatives, but of course it's very difficult to move away from a dike-based system of coastal protection to more soft measures. How do we do this? Can we safely open up the dikes? And that's a very difficult discussion currently as well, and one that can only occur over a period of decades to generate a level of acceptance for alternative perspectives here. So some of the governance challenges within this context. An issue here is that climate adaptation is viewed very much as a technical task rather than a broader challenge for society. And I think this is actually a disadvantage in a sense. Yes, it is very positive that there is a very high level of technical knowledge and expertise, but there would seem to be an over-reliance. And this is something we can maybe discuss later on in the discussion section if there is time. I think there is a need for greater community engagement and openness towards different perspectives, focusing on a transformation of society in the long term, learning how to live with the sea in a different way. Here you can see some examples of current practices at the Watton Sea coast. This tractor bus is actually from the Danish context, the Danish Watton Sea, where they actually bring tourists with these buses to one of the islands, and as a way of crossing this tidal landscape and adapting to the local conditions. We also see here in the bottom left a dwelling mound surrounded by the sea, and this is on a very low-lying Hallig Island, which you can see in the bottom right as well, which actually floods many times every winter, and the houses are built on dwelling mounds so that they are raised above the sea, and for days at a time they may be cut off from the other houses on the island and really need to fend for themselves. But this has been part of life on the Hallig Islands for centuries. So this is, in a sense, a method of adaptation that has been there for a very long time. In the middle, we also see a cafe on a very popular beach, which is built on very high stilts, again, to allow for the tide coming in. But it's, there's also a strong adaptation element here, that it's also secure with rising sea levels. So there are, if you like, everyday examples of adaptation in practice, which I think need to be part of these more technical discussions on coastal management and climate adaptation also. So in terms of some transferable lessons, I think there's a need here in some of these difficult contexts, and it's not unusual to have these conflicts between nature conservation and coastal protection. There needs to be an emphasis on working towards pragmatic, negotiated compromises. In this case of the Watton Sea, these discussions are very, there's a strong element of ideology behind them as well. And this needs to be recognized too, that it is about changing paradigms, about changing long-held beliefs in terms of how to work with the coast. So working towards these compromise solutions requires a huge amount of engagement and investment in these processes. I think it's critical to find the right balance between expert-driven technical approaches and community engagement. And this is where projects like CCAT come in as well, with a very strong emphasis on innovative approaches towards community engagement and really engaging with some of these contentious, difficult contexts also. So it's really about finding this balance of bringing in multiple perspectives to really have an approach that is focused on long-term change, providing a long-term perspective. And as the previous speaker mentioned, the long-term is often closer than we think. But we need to foster this awareness of change. Just before I finish, in relation to the island of Sylt, in a discussion I had there with an interview partner as part of my recent research, they were saying that really what needs to happen over the next 50 to 100 years is perhaps that some of the villages on the western side of the island may need to be moved to the east, to be relocated. But he was concerned that the time to do this, that this might be necessary in say 50 to 100 years time, but that amount of time is too short. That was the argument, that is actually too short to have this transformative change in mindsets within the community, that 50 years may be too short for these types of processes because of the property rights involved, the impacts on individuals, the resistance to change. So, I think that provides food for thought as well, that at times, these processes are very much long-term, they are generational, but they need to be tackled nonetheless. Okay, so that's it for me. Thank you for listening. I deliberately kept it short to allow time for discussion. I've included one reference here to my own work. I've produced a number of papers from this research. You'll find more on my website as well, and my email address is here also. So yeah, I look forward to the discussion, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Cormac, and thank you for, I guess, really looking at it from a very different perspective from things that are happening in Germany around the Wadden Sea and what's being done. I thought it was very interesting to kind of hear your reflections on that technical approach and that, I guess, engineering focus of climate adaptation. And I guess I had a question around, what is the uptake or the interest from local authorities, from decision makers to take that more integrated, holistic view around bringing in communities and bringing in that kind of broader perspective? What's how does the lay of the land lie around that sort of discussion?
Yeah, these are difficult conversations, definitely, and I mean it's partly due to resourcing. Currently, I think Germany, the expenditure on coastal defense is approximately 150 million per year. So it's very, very substantial, and this is partly from the federal government level and from the federal states as well, and with a much smaller portion coming from the EU also. But so within this context, of course, the local authorities are primarily concerned that there is continued investment in coastal protection, and they do not wish to rock the boat in a sense. There is opposition certainly to opening up the dikes. That's an almost taboo topic because, as I mentioned, this is really a very, very long tradition of living behind the dikes. It's very, very difficult to change that, and the coastal protection authorities are very, very reluctant to even suggest that there may be a risk to the communities behind the dikes in future years. They are very reluctant to open that discussion. So from that perspective, the municipalities, the local authorities are in a difficult position, if you like, and this is where community engagement needs to come in a sense to fill that gap and to have these broader discussions which go beyond what is possible in technical terms, what is possible within the remit of existing programs.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think it's an important reflection to think about not only taking account of traditional ways of living, but also traditional ways of decision making, and how our governance processes over time kind of box us into certain decisions because of that's how it's always been done and that's the way decisions are made. I think that's a really important governance reflection when we think about climate change adaptation for the future. So thank you for raising that. There are some questions that have popped into the Q&A, so we'll come back to those after we've heard from our final speaker of this morning. So thank you very much, Cormac. Hugh, it's lovely to see you here. I'd like to introduce Hugh Williams, who's here to talk to us from the, I need to get the right way round, the Fairbourne Moving Forward project. Hugh, would you like to share your screen to make sure we can see your slides? You should just be able to press the green share screen button. There we go, it's coming up.
Does that work?
Yes, perfect. And we can hear you perfectly. So thank you very much for joining us. And I will hand over to you and we'll have questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Emma. I'm going to discuss climate change in Gwynedd. Gwynedd is a local authority in North Wales, and the coastal flood risk management perspective is becoming a big issue for Gwynedd as an authority, as is climate change. I will start with politics. My belief is that political commitment is essential if we're going to live in a different world with a confident long-term vision. I measure political commitment in terms of level of funding, and the level of funding for adaptation is not a great sum of money. So that is of prime concern for myself. Starting with the perspective of what does the public know? When Gwynedd adopted the shoreline management plan, I and my colleagues, and Greg Guthrie was with us for some of these visits, we went to every community council, town council, city council. And what became evident is people like the shoreline, they like the sea, but they're totally unaware of what's going on. They're unaware of coastal change. They think it's going to be minor, not going to really affect their day-to-day life. So the physical changes that we're facing now, let alone in the future, is passing them by, as is coastal erosion. Coastal landslips get more attention because it's more dramatic. And coastal accretion is almost invisible from the public's perspective. Coastal change can and does pose a threat to the coastal communities. They accept that in principle, but engaging with that intellectually and not as if it can happen now locally, there seems to be a gap there. Effect on infrastructure, heritage, habitats and wildlife, including the loss of homes and land. So we were faced with getting these very basic messages through to the town councillors and the public at large, because if we started with the 60% of the coastal of the Welsh population lives along the coast, it sounds almost Big Brotherish. And then when we say there's 220,000 homes at risk, ooh, you're trying to scare us now. And NRW are saying that due to erosion, over 2,000 properties will be lost by turn of the century. So it's getting them to understand what's happening locally in terms of change and how that fits into the national picture. Moving to the authorities of Western Wales, we've been grappling with the challenges of nature, which is what climate change is. It's not something that's been created by local authorities. It's a global problem, and therefore we're engaging with, well, I'm engaging with Gwynedd Council, and we're engaging with the communities, and there are numerous communities from Cllr, Pwllheli, Porthmadog and Fairbourne, which I'll come to later on. And what in these unprecedented times, what's important is that we've got to be alive to the need for culture change, behaviour change, building capacity. I know that the within the local authority community, the capacity in terms of dealing with climate change and the risk of flooding is not at its strongest, to say the least. So we need investment, and investment requires political support. As I was saying in the other slide, 60% living along the Welsh coastline. So villages are very much on the front line. So that puts those people in a very vulnerable position. And if you can put yourself in their place, when people come and start talking about towns could be underwater in the future, there's either outrage or it'll never happen. They will protect us. In terms of stats, and we're going to give you many stats today, We've got tidal gauges in Barmouth and we've got one in Holyhead, and what that information is giving us, dating back from 1990, Welsh Government have adopted that there will be sea level rise of up to 1 metre within 100 years, and we're on that line or slightly above. So it is happening, and that has done a lot to address the challenges that we've made, that climate change isn't happening. So, and the odd disaster helps as well, not the disaster in terms of loss of life. The transport links within Wales, they run primarily along the coastline. And what happened in 2013-14 was the Cambrian rail line was closed for a period of 6 months because it's not resilient. It cannot face climate change without big money, big adaptation, and maybe even relocating the railway line. So that is something that we can give as an example to communities to say this is real. So within Gwynedd, we've got several challenges, and in terms of the current shoreline management plan, we had 35 actions which Gwynedd was to lead on as the lead authority. But 26 of those actions involve planning for realignment, which means, as we know, adaptation planning, strategic planning in areas which are subject to MaREI realignment. Now, this scares the authority because it's a big change. It's not going to be a vote winner. So the messages that we giving the authority is that things are bad. It's not going to get any better, and the sooner we start pressing for the plan to, or to plan ahead for the future, the better situation Gwynedd will be in. Currently, there's a shoreline management plan refresh process ongoing, and obviously there'll be a resulting action plan or plans. Going back to the current shoreline management plan, those actions can be quite severe in terms of managed realignment, but even the small actions like consulting with a body or bodies, they're very important because the action plan, that is that consultation is the starting, is not the end of anything, because that consultation is not going to make the coastal communities more resilient. It's got to lead to something. So therefore we've got to own and live these action plans. Moving to Fairbourne, this picture says the story. Fairbourne is a coastal community in the real sense of the word. It's for 24 times a year, the level, even with current sea level rise, the level of the sea is higher than Fairbourne. So the urgency is there. In terms of national leadership, this has got to come from Welsh Government in Wales, obviously, but it can't be prescriptive. It's got to be national facilitation, because every community is different. The challenges they face, the threat they face, the matrix of the community itself. So there is no single solution. But to do this type of facilitation and engagement with community costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of time. So properly funded partnership approach is required. The photograph on the bottom left of the screen is what happened in 2013. A lot of agricultural land was underwater and the campsite, but the village itself, thankfully, was spared. So in Fairbourne, we're having to see that adaptation is essential because of coastal change. So we're changing from the present defence, which is the responsibility of Natural Resources Wales, which is currently hold the line, to realign defences. And where are those defences going to be? We'll come to that in the next slide. So this is managed realignment on a large scale within the context of Wales. And for some areas adjacent to Fairbourne, there will be no defences into entering active intervention. But the conversation that we keep having with the community is we're not doing this to them. What we're dealing with is a natural ongoing coastal change and the impacts of the increasing impacts of climate change, whereby in Fairbourne we've had to rebuild the defences, or NRW rebuilt the defences on Freer Corner, and a significant amount of shingle has been moved in order to increase the protection for the community. But one thing I do believe in is that the communities deserve proactive planning. So we've got to start with the end in mind. What's this going to look like in the future? And the future, I would go back to the shoreline management plan, is the long term, which is 100 years. The challenge for Fairbourne is population of 700 residents, but within the summer months, because it's a holiday destination, that number would double, if not treble. So it's a very busy place in the summer, and there's some 400 properties and businesses within that community. And supporting communities, I think, is essential. And that's where the link with the agenda of CCAT, of helping communities to adapt, is crucial, because we need to support each other. Because at the end of the day, we've got to operate as a family, supporting each other for a common goal of adapting to climate change. On the right, half metre sea level rise, and it's not going to be looking good for Fairbourne if there's a breach in the embankment or the open coast defence. Fairbourne will be in the water. And in terms of managed realignment, we are talking of the railway line in all probability. So that puts then discussions we're having then with Network Rail, Scottish Power, Cymru. So, you know, the engagements that we've got in terms of partners and other bodies is significant. Fairbourne itself, I think this sketch says all that is to say, really. The ground level is up to 3 metres. Extreme weather in 2019 is well above that. So the defences are going to be unsustainable over the longer term. There's no way around that. How do you decommission, or how do we decommission a village in 2054? As the timeline looking forward, 2054 is a little over 30 years, so that's not long term. So we've got to start planning in the here and now and come up with getting the community on board in terms of buying to what the future could look like and will look like. In terms of politicians, I don't want to be having too much of a go at politicians, because we've got some very able and supportive MPs and Assembly members in Wales. But as a collective, what we tend to find, and I've been dealing with Fairbourne since 2013, I've got a question: do they retain what they've already been told? Because what I'm finding, I'm having to say the same thing now as I was in 2013. And this is keeping climate change and the need for adaptation. It's got to be higher in the political agenda, and it's got to feel real. Otherwise, it's react and forget. Communication and collaboration with Fairbourne community. It's these people, they're normal people, they're lovely people, and in their desires, they want to live a happy and content life. But community in Fairbourne, this is, as I've said, unsustainable. So what we've done in terms of communication, we've had created a website, we've had a lot of hits, public events, more than I can count, newsletters, which at some periods were quarterly. We've offered counselling to the community, we've had information days, we've had tea and cake clubs, and we've had stakeholder workshops. Because our plan, if you like, at the beginning was the journey was going to be consultation that would lead to engagement, that would lead to involvement and ongoing management. And moving to a mindset whereby we were going to, not what you're going to do about this, because there's a big belief that they will sort this out. So we wanted to be in a place with what are we going to do about this and do that together. That approach was torpedoed really by a BBC programme week in, week out in 2014 and 2015, with the headline, or the headline strap was, this village will have to be abandoned in 10 years' time, which was clearly inaccurate. And the community got very upset, very verbal, and we had to do a lot of communication in terms of getting the basic facts understood by everybody, which has proven to be difficult, stroke impossible at times. We had 130 frequently asked questions, which we circulated to every property owner, and was made widely available on the web, through public events, through the newsletters. So we've been working very hard in trying to collaborate with the community. But the question that the community are coming back to us is, and they're realistic questions, we'd be asking the same question, or questions. Who makes the decisions? Who benefits? Who loses? And more importantly, who pays? So there are challenging decisions in the future, and they've got to be faced. We're fortunate in Wales that we got the Wellbeing and Futures Generation Act, which puts a requirement on public bodies to think about the long term. So that aligns with the Shoreline Management Plan. Where possible, improve the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales. So all these things sound and are very good principles, working better with people, communities and each other, which is what we're trying to do in Fairbourne. Look to prevent problems and take a more joint-up approach. The other topic of conversation, that is, what is well-being? So it could be as simple as feeling good and functioning well. But we've come in discussions with the Public Health Board. 3 factors that can protect our mental well-being, and these are well advertised, is having a sense of control over our lives, feeling included and able to participate, being resilient and having access to support where it's needed. So all these things are excellent statements, but when you put it in the context of Fairbourne and having to move a community because of sea level rise and the adaptation that's necessary to move them out of harm's way, is to relocate that community at some point in time. So it becomes a very prickly conversation very quickly, because we want them to work with us and they want the answers from us. Coming to the last slide now, in terms of the master plan, which was done in 2018, the framework for the future was done in 19, and then in 2020, Welsh Government produced a national strategy for flood and coastal erosion risk management for Wales, which aligns with the commitments to invest in hard defences, but we've got to manage risks without depending on hard defences. And that means a progressive change, and it's really outside the traditional assessment structure that we've used and we're used to so far in terms of tackling climate change. So with that agenda, so that's a clear agenda, but the effective communication in Fairbourne is a challenge because you've got three camps within the population, or three groups. A quarter of the population is an aged population. They're happy with their lives and they are firmly of the belief that nothing's going to happen within their lifetime. Approximately less than half, they're in denial, and all they want to is not hear about the threats to Fairbourne, but to get on with their lives. The remainder are stressed and worried, and they've got a place to be stressed and worried, and they're demanding definitive plans and solutions now. Where we are now is we're currently starting to address what's the future going to look like. Start with the end in mind, protecting the community for as long as we possibly can prior to relocating and decommissioning the community, which sounds harsh and coarse, but what we're trying to do is do it with the community, and that's why we're going to be implementing the health impact assessment, which is the looking at the well-being of Fairbourne as it's affected by climate change. So this is a model. So this is a model that can be used to come up with a preferred model for how we deal with a community under the threat of having to adapt in a major way, which is going to affect all the community. So this will inform the process of decommissioning and the relocation in terms of potential effects on health of the population and the distribution of effects within the population. So to close, we want to work with the community to extend the life of the community for as long as possible, but at a point in time, actions will have to be taken in order to protect the health, safety and well-being of that community. And it's a big job and it's a big decision. Thank you very much, and I'll stop there. So, diolch yn fawr, thank you, and questions.
Thank you so much, Hugh. That was great and really useful, I think, to hear the perspectives of somewhere that's really experiencing the reality of climate change and those difficult decisions that you mentioned during your talk. So what I'm going to do is ask, just because in the interest of time, there is a question that's specifically for you, but what I'll do while you're answering that is ask all of our panelists from today, so all our speakers from today, to switch their cameras back on so we can have a conversation and kind of have that discussion panel. Hugh, there was a question for you from Greg, who you mentioned in your talk, but he said, do you feel we hide behind great statements of principle, but are way behind actually delivering on these principles?
I've worked closely with Greg, and there is alignment. Big statements and further studies are used as techniques to buy time, because the need to take positive action in terms of getting communities on board and to live in terms of what needs to happen is a big ask, but that work has got to start here.
Thank you. I think that one of the key messages that you kind of reiterated multiple times, I think, in your talk, is that we have to make these decisions, we have to act now and take that proactive approach, but also invest and provide the resources to allow for that engagement with different sectors, with communities, and bring people into the conversation soon. We can't wait. And again, that echoes some of the comments that kind of came out of the event in 2020 and some of the points that have been raised by a number of our speakers this morning. So thank you. It was a really great talk to end on and really brought together a number of those points.
I'd like to make one other point.
Yeah, of course.
Leadership means making decisions with uncertain consequences. So that is a brave step forward. But I don't think any of us would like the statements with the knowledge of hindsight, you should have done this, that and the other. We've got to do something. I think doing nothing is the worst of all possible options.
Yeah, No, I think that's an important point. Thank you very much. And leadership is difficult, I suppose, and it's about making those challenging decisions and those difficult decisions and balancing all of those different things that you mentioned. You know, you can understand why people are worried and understand why they're perhaps in denial and don't want to recognize the reality, because actually it's not very nice. It's not nice to think about, and you can kind of understand those perspectives. So it's important to bring all of that into that discussion. So thank you all so much for such great talks this morning, and thank you to our attendees who've posted some really great comments and questions. We're a little bit behind schedule, but if you guys are okay to stay for a little bit longer, just maybe a little bit after 1, we'll try and get through as many of the questions as we can. There was a question that so our attendees were able to upvote questions that were posted. And so Robin, there's a question for you that's been posed by Rhoda Ballinger, who said that it's brilliant to see the guide and great to see some examples, and that was definitely echoed by a number of people, to kind of just highlighting that those global examples that you brought into your talk. But Rhoda says there have been many attempts to engage planners with shoreline management in England and Wales over the last few decades, but we still have issues with a lack of engagement. Why do you think that that is the case, and how are you promoting and monitoring the use of your guide, which I guess is to try and address that challenge? So I'll hand that over to you.
Well, I'm not sure that there's a lack of engagement between engineers and planners, or with planners more widely through local government. I mean, for many years now, the coastal groups have had planning officers from planning policy as part of their membership, and also the local government association, for example, Coastal Special Interest Group, planners are represented on that as well. But I think the main focus in the past in relation to issues surrounding coastal change has been directed at engineers. So the purpose of this guide really is to focus more on the planning issues, planning policy in particular, as local plans are being updated, to ensure that statements relating to coastal change management areas, in particular drawing on the SMPs, are actually included. And there are some very good examples that we've included in the guide. I mean, as far as getting the message across more widely, I think it's proved beneficial having the support of an international consultancy. Jacobs has, I don't know, 300,000 staff worldwide, and so the opportunities for dissemination have been huge. And since the guide actually was launched online, there has been a really positive response through networks, for example, such as LinkedIn, as well as more widely. So we've got a very good take up so far, and we hope that planners, not just in this country, but across the world, will be taking advantage of it. And we will obviously monitor feedback. There'll be opportunities at international conferences, but really getting the message across. We've gone for obviously an online guide because of the practicalities of trying to distribute worldwide. And so it's readily available for everyone to pick up, and hopefully planners will be just as interested as engineers in terms of looking at this guide, which is essentially a non-technical document, and hopefully provides practical examples that they can share and take up if they feel so inclined.
Thanks, Robin. And of course, sustainability issues with having them online as well. So we can,
absolutely.
There is obviously still a footprint, but
yes,
yeah, we've had that challenge with other reports as well. So thank you very much for that. Cormac, I noticed that there was a point that you wanted to respond to live from Philip. So I would welcome you to do that. To me, it was more of a comment. But I would really welcome your response to this comment. So this is from Philip and Bennett Lloyd, who said that tackling perceptions of coastal risk can be very challenging when policy making and actions have for so long been linear. So lines of defence, shoreline management plans, defending the line. So taking in that use of the line and what that might mean in terms of coastal management. And Kim Peters did a wonderful talk for the RGS actually over the summer around that use of lines within marine and coastal spaces. And really Philip's point is how we define and communicate those topics around a coastal zone and think about that linearity, I suppose, and the need for a different language. So I will open the floor, Cormac, to you around reflecting on that point. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, I think it's a very important point, and something that's very much chimed with Hugh Williams' talk also. You know, in the terms of the challenges of moving away from a hold the line strategy, and certainly one of the insights from my research at the North Sea coast in Germany is how powerful this symbolic boundary is at the coast, and you know that this protected coastline is taken for granted. It's something that is given, even though really historically it's an artificial construct. And really we should be thinking about how to move back towards a situation where there is a much more gradual transition between the land and the sea, and taking a broader coastal zone perspective. And of course, integrated coastal zone management is nothing new, but I think it is something that we need to put increasing emphasis on at the moment, because currently with the increasing attention to marine spatial planning, the divide between marine and land-based policy and planning is actually in a lot of cases increasing. So there is this coastal squeeze, if you like, in policy terms, and a need for really much more integrated perspectives across the land-sea interface. So I think this is really a critical issue to tackle climate adaptation of the coast in a more holistic way.
Thank you, Cormac. I think that's such an interesting point to think about, that coastal squeeze in a policy and governance context, and think about how we develop climate smart marine spatial planning that takes account of that dynamism and flexibility and that change that's going to keep happening in our coastal spaces, and that interaction, you know, that they don't stop at the coast, they don't stop at the high tide mark. It's a much more fluid system, no pun intended in that whatsoever. Thank you very much. There's a question that's come in from Eugene Farrell, who I'm actually going to pose it to everybody really, which is kind of recognizing what's happened over the last year and a half, and the fact that we are in a very strange time, and that the impact of that may be another global economic downturn, a recession, and that this might impact the plans and the ideas and innovation that we've put in place to address climate change adaptation. How do we future-proof against those? And I guess the fact that that economic downturn could happen anytime, how do we ensure that our approaches, our activities are future-proofed and can be delivered despite those challenges? I'm not sure who would like to go for that first. I feel like Cormac and Robin have already answered, but it's up to you guys. Robin's unmuted. Oh, James unmuted. Go for it, James.
I'll have a go.
You go.
Yeah, I mean, it's a grand question. Yeah, don't have enough information to add to it fully, but I will say that this might sound a bit of a political answer to this, but there's obviously a lot of discussion about green recovery from COVID, and the fact that this provides an opportunity to maybe rethink the way that we've previously operated in terms of managing the environment and all parts of society. So it is obviously going to put a lot of pressure potentially on resources and organizations, but I think one of the things that I always try and get across to local authorities and people involved in climate action is that climate action and adaptation can cover a lot of, one action can actually have a lot of co-benefits for a lot of different things. So providing green space for flooding, for example, can be a park, it can offer recreation and all these other societal well-being and increases as well. So I would say maybe it's that necessity is the mother of invention, that maybe we start to inspire new ways of approaching these problems. That's the very optimistic way of looking at this. Well,
I'm all about the optimism. I love it. I always like to end on an optimistic note. That's a good idea. Cormac, you raised your hand. Do you want to come in on that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think this is really a critical issue, and certainly from the Irish perspective, there is a realization and a certain cynicism that what is announced in national development plans is always dependent on what the economic climate will be like in the next 5 years, you know, the very, very short-term cycles. And what is really needed is a long-term commitment of resources and investment program in coastal management. There's no way around that, similar to how you would have long-term funding for a pension scheme, for example. Yeah, it's something on a similar scale that certainly at the North Sea coast, what I'm familiar with, there would be decisions, you know, that have been made looking 100 years into the future, building coastal defenses with a 100-year time horizon. This is what needs to be done. Whether it's, you know, hard engineering or it's soft management solutions, we've talked about how both require investment of resources and both require investment of time as well. So this long-term proactive planning and time horizon is really critically important for this.
Thank you very much for that. Does anybody? Yes, Robin. We'll have one more and then we'll move on to, and Hugh. Okay, right. Okay, Robin and Hugh.
I was just going to say that, you know, local authorities have lost over 40% of their budgets, and this has had a huge effect on staffing. Many local authorities are devoid of coastal engineers and their technical staff, and certainly planners have been affected as well. And local authorities have been looking at what functions do they have to do, what's non-statutory. And of course, as I mentioned in my presentation, coast protection is not a mandatory local authority function. Planning is, but even so, it's they're still not protected from cuts. So the ways of trying to take everything forward that we're talking about is going to be very challenging for the next few years, I think.
Thanks, Robin. Hugh?
Yes, I think Robin's correct. We're not short of challenges. The recession is going to be an economic squeeze, and I'm a bit optimistic because I think during the COVID period, it's enabled local authorities to almost reset what is important, what are the solutions. The TAN 15 coming out, and that's got a lot of information, as did the NRW flood maps. So the government and local authorities are having to readjust these new pieces of information. And I think the planners are more on board than they've been historically. But what is difficult is that we talk about the long term, and schools, social services want the cash now. So it becomes that difficult. Welsh Government have taken climate change on board in the global sense, in that they've got a super directors now named climate change. So they're bringing everything that's to do with carbon or adaptation under one roof, so to speak. So that's a huge step forward. So that's where my optimism is, that it will be reviewed in a possible light in terms of tourism, environmental gain. So there are positives to this in terms of what the new world will look like.
Thank you, Hugh. Again, always happy to hear positivity at the end of these sessions. Izzy, go for it. It's nice to have everybody respond to this question.
Yeah, so I am coming from communities and advocacy's point of view again. One thing that we could do as communities and as citizens is to keep the sustained engagement around those things, continue to whip up, not necessarily sentiments, but continue to whip up sentiments, you know, around these issues, because these are some ways of making them continued front burner issues. I mean, Professor Robin just said something about some deficiencies in staffing, staff strengths and all of that. And if you don't have people to advocate for the fact that there's a need to staff up, I mean, it could just go under the not so important things to sort at the moment, especially in face of the economic climate that we are seeing right now. We want to prioritize, we want the competing claims to take precedence. So from the communities and advocacy's point of view, I think sustaining engagement and advocacy around these issues could help to push them to the front burner as thought patterns and processes are being fashioned out, so that relevant contributions can be on the table when decisions are being made. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think that's a really kind of important point, reflecting back on some of what James said in his talk about making climate change and climate adaptation part of the everyday, and making sure that, where there have been cuts, that doesn't get lost, because it is just part of all of those conversations, and it happens when we talk about transport and infrastructure and all of those different things that we've highlighted over the last few talks. And there have been some comments around the importance of marine biodiversity and working with nature. And of course, all of that is part of that same conversation. And those topics are hopefully going to be covered a little bit over the next couple of days. And I'm going to ask a couple of more questions before I draw the session to a close. So I'm going to come to a question. Oh, I've had a chat box come up in my way and I can't see the question I was going to ask. It's hidden. Hugh, this question's for you from Liz Morris-Webb, who's just said how interesting it was to hear more about Fairbourne and to thank you for your talk, and recognising how exceptionally challenging and difficult and sad really it is for the community there, and how challenging it is for them. She says that she can see that people are still trying to sell houses in Fairbourne. Is there a compulsory purchase or compensation type procedure in Fairbourne, similar to the one that Robin mentioned in his talk, which I'm not sure you were online for, but is there any kind of support mechanism or compulsory purchase mechanism that's in place for the community in Fairbourne?
There's no blight, no compensation. So that's the simple answer to that one. In terms of properties being sold in Fairbourne, the value of the properties have come down to such a level whereby they're now selling quite frequently as second homes, and they're becoming businesses, Airbnb, because if 2054 is correct, there's sufficient time to repay the debt and make a profit. So over time, the age of the population is going to be different. The mindset is going to be different, and the problems will evolve and be different over time. And that's why we need this interactive discussions with the community on an ongoing basis, because the situation today and 5 years hence is going to be slightly different. So no compensation, but the properties are changing hands, but they're selling for cash. There's no mortgages available.
Okay, thank you. That's useful context for that. And again, it highlights the importance of this engagement being an ongoing conversation. It's not a once only kind of situation. It's a process that must continue. Cormac, I'm going to come to you with a question next, if that's okay. And there's a question from Luciana Estevez from Bournemouth, who's kind of said, thank you for sharing some of the clear complexities that arise on theme around working with nature and that compromise that you mentioned. Is managed realignment and or relocation from high-risk areas being discussed in Germany at policy level? So I guess drawing on some of what Hugh has talked to us about, is a similar conversation happening in Germany at a political level?
Yeah, good question. Managed realignment is really seen as a fallback option in Germany, which is not, there are no concrete examples of it at the coast. It has happened in a few places in very limited context on some of the major rivers, but not on the coast to date. And even on the small Hallig Islands, which I mentioned, they are, islands which are literally at the sea level, which are flooded a number of times a year. And there, from a rational point of view, based on a lot of the assumptions and much of the literature on managed retreat, you would assume that would be the preferred option there. And it's not. The people still want to live there, and their livelihoods there are actually actively supported by the by government as well for cultural heritage reasons, essentially. Yeah, so it's similar to, I guess, the way the Gaeltacht communities would be supported in Ireland. So yeah, it often is the case that managed retreat does not occur where you might think it would for purely technical, rational reasons. And so far, it is, yeah, I mean, it is something that might happen in the future on some of the islands, that a settlement would be relocated to the other side of the island to give increased protection. But as I mentioned before, they are very, very difficult conversations and very, very far away from current planning practice as it is at the moment.
Thank you, Cormac, for that additional detail. That was really helpful. In the interest of time, I'm going to pose one final question. Unfortunately, we can't get through every question because I know we're run over and I don't want to keep you all for too much longer. But what I would like to do is slightly tweak a question that's been posted by Laura, who said, what are the biggest obstacles when trying to implement the recommendations from the guide? And this question was for Robin, but actually all of you have presented different recommendations and different ideas and initiatives around climate change adaptation and working in coastal spaces. So I guess my question is kind of broader than that. So like, what are from your perspective, what are the biggest obstacles or challenges, and what can be done to improve or address them? So it's a question for each of you to reflect on. Robin, you are unmuted, and so I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay. Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sorry, you froze for a minute.
Oh, sorry. The joys of 2021 conferencing, you know, we just got to live with it. So I'll reiterate the question. It's taking one of the questions that was posted for you, but just so that everybody can respond to it. And it's, what is, in your opinion, what is the key challenge and how do we address it? So a big question, not small.
Well, in terms of what I've been talking about in terms of planning, I think it's getting the message across, trying to provide it in a non-technical way that is easily understandable, and ensuring that actually sound sustainable policies are built into the planning framework. And then we've got a way for going forward. Unfortunately, there's still so much development taking place both on the coast and in other vulnerable locations, and development pressures that we're still building up further problems for us for the future. So I think that's really one of the reasons why we really felt that trying to get the message across to planning was a really important step forward.
Thank you, Robin. James, I'm going to come to you next.
Yeah, I mean, totally agree with Robin as well. But to build on that from I suppose from a more of the science side of it, I think certainly in the Irish context, and less so in the UK now that with SMPs and that side of things, but in terms of establishing national approaches to data and information to support adaptation, I think that's one of my approaches to a lot of my work is to try and ensure that we cover everywhere with the same amount of data. So it doesn't matter whether you're living in Dublin or you're living in a very rural part of the country, you still have access to the same level of information and data that other places do, so that you can then try and implement adaptation. A lot of the time, data is collected quite piecemeal, or there isn't a longer term collection process in place. And I think that's a real barrier to implementation and looking at that longer term sort of ideas and engaging with what needs to be done, because we don't have that longer term sort of security of those sorts of background data required to implement action.
Thank you, James. Cormac, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, I think well, a key part of the challenge, let's say, is, as I mentioned before, getting the balance right between technical expertise, resourcing, and effective community engagement. I'm putting these three ingredients together in the context of long-term proactive planning strategies for coastal change.
Thank you, Cormac. Izzy, I'll come to you, and then Hugh for the final reflections.
Okay, so from a community engagement perspective, when all the science is done, when all the technical aspect is decided on, it is useful to always have it in relatable context and relatable language, so that community members can have enough attention and understand well enough to take it forward. So while the tech, the science, and every other part of it is going on, community members on the ground can lend voices, agitate, whip up sentiments and all that needs to go into bringing the attention. So I think today, I'm from the standpoint of voices. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Hugh, finally.
The key challenges are, we're quite lucky in Wales, we've got the Welsh Coastal Monitoring Centre, and that's good for sharing data. So we've got commonality in the way it's collected and what we do with that data, and it's in a common format. But that leads us to probably more joint agency collaboration. It is happening with NRW, local authorities, National Trust, to name a few. But really, it's got to be taken forward with vigour and with the end in mind, so that we're not sitting on action plans, that they do get actioned, which is stating the obvious. But that requires finance and resources. Without the finance, without the resources, we'll be still having the same discussions in 5 years' time.
Thank you so much for those thoughts on that question. I thought it was a really great way to bring together all of the themes that you've all mentioned across the morning, and to really think about what we need to take forward when we're considering climate change adaptation, and thinking about that urgent, proactive approach that all of you really have mentioned, the need for consistent and equal data collection and availability, the need to engage communities in a meaningful but accessible way, and making sure that is an ongoing process where social justice and health and well-being and all of those aspects of living on a coast and living with climate change are taken into consideration. I think we've heard about that from a range of different perspectives today, and I really am so grateful that all of you were able to join in to provide that really mixed perspective on those topics. Thank you as well to our attendees. We've had some brilliant questions and discussion points. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but we have 2 more days. So we have 2 more mornings of great speakers coming up for the rest of the week. We're taking a slight change tomorrow. So tomorrow we'll be talking to and hearing from people who are focusing on the youth voices aspects that Karen mentioned in her introduction. So we'll be hearing about student perceptions of climate change, youth voices, eco-anxiety, but also hearing from some of the schools in our CCAT case study areas. So we're actually going to get some input from those children, from those young people, and think about what that means for climate change for them, and looking to the future and looking past COP26 as well. So I really hope many of you can join us tomorrow morning. We'll be starting at 10 a.m. again. Thank you again to our speakers. I'm so glad you were here, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I thought it was a really fascinating and interesting series of talks, and I hope you'll be able to join us for the rest of the week. So with that, I will say thank you, and I will take care and see you all tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.